สัปดาห์จริงหรือโดยไม่เปิดเผยยี่ห้อเซรั่มและทดสอบกับผู้หญิง 79 คนไกลโคลิกไบรท์ Instant Glowing Serum จาก L'Oreal Paris ผลลัพธ์ที่แสดงโดยผู้เชี่ยวชาญด้านผิวหนัง
ผลลัพธ์เหลือเชื่อมากไม่คิดว่าจุดด่างดำบนใบหน้าจะจางลงได้
จุดด่างดำใต้ตาเนี่ยจางลงอย่างเห็นได้ชัดประทับใจมากค่ะ
ทดสอบทางคลินิกแล้วช่วยลดเลือนจุดด่างดำได้ถึง 57%
โดยผู้เชี่ยวชาญด้านผิวหนังเลือกใช้
L'Oreal Paris Glycolic Bright Serum
บอกต่อทุกคนแน่นอนค่ะ
Strong enough to stay. We will never break. As the water rises and the mountains shake, our love will remain. We will never, no, we will never, no.
Five of the biggest names in business choose Bloomberg. That is a great question. Five of the biggest names in business choose Bloomberg. That is a great question.
It's a great question. It's a great question.
Great question. Great question.
Great question.
Great question.
That's going to be the best question I get all.
Glad you asked that. Bloomberg Television. Top experts. Great questions. That's the scene in Taipei. Nancy Pelosi expected to meet with.
That's the scene in Taipei. Nancy Pelosi expected to meet with the president of the territory there, Tsai Ing-wen. We've got a Taiwanese dollar there just holding its own above the 30 level after slipping, of course, below that psychological point, if you will. All of this as she becomes the highest-ranking American politician to visit Taiwan in some 25 years. It was Newt Gingrich who was there in '97. Of course, at the moment we did have that's China announcing economic retaliation here as well against the territory, and on top of that we've also got military drills likely here as well. Looking at these Taiwanese assets, so not that much pressure there under them, but they have been, as we've seen something like on Monday, over $200 million of foreign outflows, and in the latest quarter over 650 now million US dollars being taken out of the Taiwan market as well. Taiwan semi moving perhaps to the upside partly because of Nancy Pelosi possibly meeting with the head of that company. So there we go. And I guess, David, how does this all really figure in the grand scheme of things for the wider region?
That's an interesting point because there's also the Fed that, there's a lot more news out of Taiwan, let's put it that way. There's a lot more material news, I would argue, when it comes to the markets and the Fed. Because of the move up in the dollar, the reminder that we're going to be in this pickle, this tightening cycle for longer. We're doing good as far as Asia goes, but keep in mind we're coming off 2-3 straight days of quite some steep losses in some of these markets. In fact, as you can see, about an hour in, we've now erased all the gains on the CSI 300. We've certainly come off highs, well off highs on the Hang Seng Index. Kospi Index 0.4% here, Vaughn.
Yeah, Eurasia Group was interesting. They put out the kind of the odds now, given just what we've seen in terms of the Beijing response, China's strong military response to Pelosi's visit. Now, when it comes to the near-term odds of a major Taiwan Strait security crisis, it's gone from 25% to 30% now. So I guess the risks are rising of some sort of confrontation. But then again, relatively speaking, we have seen Beijing a bit more restrained in how they are kind of tackling this whole issue here. They say it's provocative, obviously, but market impact pretty much has been erasing some of the losses that we've seen already. Are we bouncing back substantially here? But let's talk a bit more about the Fed. St. Louis Fed President Jim Bullard doubled down on that message that 3 other officials sent today that their top priority remains bringing down inflation, and there's still a long way to go. Let's get to our global economics and policy editor, Kathleen Hayes. And Kathleen, it seems like the Fed officials really kind of pouring some cold water on what the markets are pricing in, this Fed pivot.
Well, if you don't listen to what they say, if you don't watch what the economists are saying about the Fed, you're going to get yourself in a position where your expectations are wrong. And I think markets just convince themselves to think that, well, if it looks like the economy is slowing down, there's going to be a recession. Surely they'll have to pull back. I think it's not that the markets are so wrong that the Fed's never going to pull back. Jim Bullard, in fact, today saying, yes, the Fed has to get more restrictive, 3.75 to 4% by the end of the year on the funds rate. And he also thinks that, yes, they can pull off a soft landing because they have more credibility than Volcker did when he came in. He was untested, untried, but central banks are in a different position now. Let's listen to something he said.
I'd like to see the policy rate get to 3.75 to 4% this year. I think that inflation has come in hotter than what I would have expected during the second quarter. So now that that has happened, I think we're going to have to go a little bit higher than what I was saying before.
But he went on to say that we're go a little bit faster even we thought. But he went on to say that we're going to be more data dependent now because we've raised rates a lot. He thinks maybe this is as high as they will have to go at the end of the year. The door is open to going higher. So somewhere in the middle between the markets thinking there's going to be this big pivot and the Fed saying, look, we're not done fighting inflation yet, I think Jim Bullard has kind of showed us that there's this ground where if they're right and they've front loaded and they can keep inflation expectations down, they get a little lucky on supply chains loosening up, then maybe they can pull this off and they will have hiked rates enough without pushing inflation up as high as someone like Larry Summers would say they have to get it to really get this thing under control.
Let's
All right, so Kathleen, then let's try and figure out how wide this middle ground is for investors to stand on. How specific on what's needed in this inflation fight were Mester, Daly, and Evans, of course, the Fed officials who we've heard from these last couple of hours.
And in fact, Loretta Mester, president of the Cleveland Fed, saying that yes, actually said we don't talk about recession, we talk about trend growth above or below trend, and right now it's probably going to be below trend. But basically, she's saying that's what you need to get inflation down. And she, for specifics for her are, I have to see inflation sustainably coming down on the month-by-month numbers. We're not there yet. Mary Daly, we're nowhere near ending this inflation fight. We're starting to get under control. There's further to go. Mary Daly saying that we are resolute and completely united on achieving price stability, which doesn't mean 9.1% inflation. It means something closer to 2%. Long way to go. Charlie Evans, president of the Chicago Fed, said he thinks September we could see a 50 or 75 basis point rate hike. But then he still sees what he said in the past. For the last two meetings of the year, he thinks the Fed can crank it down a bit to 25 basis point rate hikes. He thinks it's possible they'll need a couple more of those next year. But in answer to your question, David, Brish, everybody, maybe that's what people have to start seeing. They're watching the data. They've hiked rates a lot. If the inflation starts to behave, it's not that they're going to stop hiking rates right away, even if the economy is slowing down, because they know that's probably going to happen, but they will start moving back to this less aggressive path and watch what the numbers do. If I put it all together for you, I don't know how much that helps those uncertain investors, but I think that's the message now.
Kathleen Hayes, our global economics and policy editor, going to go from one of the major themes that the markets are actually looking at to another one. And of course, Nancy Pelosi, she should be meeting with the Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen. We've got at the moment the scene there in Taipei. There we go. That's currently what's happening there. She's set to hold a joint news briefing as well. This is after speaking with legislative representatives. She's also gone out and said that she had come in peace for the region as well, perhaps trying to assuage some of the, let's say, more hawkish tone coming out of Beijing. And there we go. We've got the House Speaker there and the Taiwanese President meeting. It's not imminent anymore. It's certainly happening as we speak here as well. She's also saying that this visit in no way contradicts the long-standing U.S. policy concerning Taiwan, and the Washington opposes unilateral efforts to change the status quo. So there we go. We've got China, of course, condemning this visit. It came out and announced a series of economic and military responses, including banning of sand exports to Taiwan and indeed halting some fish and fruit imports from the island as well. The People's Liberation Army saying they would conduct long-range live firing. Okay, let's have a look at that. Leave those images there for the time being and get it over to you guys in Hong Kong.
Yep, absolutely. And I guess just to give our viewers also a little bit of more clarity on what is coming in these next couple of minutes, and obviously this meeting is imminent, with these live pictures out of Taipei. We should also be getting at some point, based on the initial agenda, these next 30 minutes after the meeting, a press conference that will follow from the House Speaker based on, I would imagine, what they already talked about. And some of the other things, in fact, about an hour or so back, that she already touched on, things like solutions to semiconductors, that it is coming at a very opportune time, given, of course, what's been happening there as far as the legislation and the CHIPS Act, I would imagine, is concerned there. So, yeah, some live pictures coming through in case you're joining us right now. This meeting between the House Speaker and the Taiwan President, Taiwan Architect.
Yeah, some fist bumps there being exchanged across the delegation of the U.S. They're taking a look at when it comes to what we've heard so far from Nancy Pelosi. She did talk a little more about how this trip was supported by bipartisan support in Congress as well. She did applaud Taiwan's COVID response and did talk a little bit more about China's human rights record, security, the economy, the like here. So a range of topics that were talked about during the Parliament session just a few hours ago. But certainly a lot to talk to when it comes to the president, as we talked about Washington Post talking about this meeting that Pelosi may have with the TSMC CEO Mark Liu as well. So we'll continue to watch this one and bring in the lines as they cross this morning. Well, coming up, how the global growth slowdown, supply chain issues, and geopolitical risks are affecting Taiwan's semiconductor industry. We'll break that down with Sebastian Ho of Bloomberg Berman, Taiwan, next as we continue Nancy Pelosi's trip, our coverage in Taiwan. This is Bloomberg.
ไม้สังเคราะห์ SCG ล็อกสีสวยทนจากทุกสภาพแวดล้อมที่มีเทคโนโลยี Color Lock Plus
What's happening on Wall Street?
It's the basic law of economics.
It validated what the market was already pricing.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management. It's a challenging dynamic.
We could continue to see that kind of strength.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
10:40 there in the morning in Taiwan. This is the scene there as we've got the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, on this controversial trip to the territory, meeting there with the president of it, Tsai Ing-wen. We do have right now, certainly, Pelosi calling for peace in Asia, just ahead of course, meeting with the president of Taiwan. China announcing military drills and restricting some Taiwan exports as well. So there we go. That's what we have. And Pelosi trying to assuage concerns in Beijing, saying that the visit is not at odds with its long-standing U.S. policy on the territory.
Yeah, so that's some latest lines here, Rich, just to mark. Yeah, for our viewers here, the cabinet here commenting while these scenes are taking place, that the government, the Taiwan government, will ensure the flight safety in the surrounding areas. That the cabinet also commenting on these military in the markets, the stabilization fund to ensure to monitor these markets closely. Yvonne.
And I think just some background on Nancy Pelosi and why maybe Beijing is angry about her being in Taiwan is 1991. You bring back to about 30 years ago or so when she was in Beijing and she did hold that pro-democracy banner at Tiananmen Square. And I think that's kind of what shaped her sort of policy when it comes to China and why she is such a China hawk. And maybe that's why we are seeing such tension when it comes to this meeting. But here you are seeing President Tsai Ing-wen speaking here and introducing the House Speaker as well. Steve, what could we expect in this meeting, this exchange?
Yeah, again, I think they're going to be talking in fairly broad brushstrokes about the importance of supporting Taiwan based on the U.S.-Taiwan Relations Act that kind of upholds their cooperation, obviously, in light of the some would say, saber-rattling coming from Beijing. I think they will speak in pleasantries. They're also going to talk about semiconductors, obviously, on a strategic front and economic front. Nancy Pelosi, I'm sure she's going to be making some statements about why she supports Taiwan. As you just alluded to, her positioning in the past has been a bit of a hawk towards Beijing as she unveiled that placard in 1991 in Tiananmen Square. Her constituency is San Francisco. It has a large Asian population, and she is acting on behalf of what she believes are the interests of her Asian constituents. So a lot of people said she probably wouldn't go, but in hindsight, not much of a surprise, given that midterm elections could change her position as no longer being House Speaker.
Yeah, and Steve, the wider context here, and the White House has pushed back that this is not an official visit.
Right.
At the same time, though, you can't help but think that if they wanted to keep her from going, they could have certainly prevented her and done something else. And just help us understand the nuance there. Right?
Sure, and I think Joe Biden did stress this to Xi Jinping in their phone call that the executive and legislative branches of the government are equal but separate parts of the government, in addition to, of course, the judicial arm of the government, and that he could not necessarily order her not to go. I think he was counseled by the Pentagon that now would not be a good time for her to go, given the geopolitical tensions and the saber-rattlings, if you want to call it that, coming from Beijing and the threats of possible military intervention. The Pentagon thought it was not a good idea. We are hearing from sources within the Pelosi camp is that at the end of the day, Nancy Pelosi would have backed away from this trip had Joe Biden directly asked her, don't go. Now, sources as well as John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesperson, said Biden never spoke directly to Pelosi, telling her not to go. Hence, she's there.
All right, Steve certainly going to be monitoring these events as we also expect a visit to TSMC by the House Speaker. The tech sector there in Taiwan very much in focus during this visit. Let's get to Debbie Wu, who joins us now. She's, of course, Asia Tech reporter. Debbie, what do we know about this and what will the conversation entail?
So right now we know that Pelosi reportedly is expected to meet with Chairman Mark Liu of TSMC today, although TSMC's spokeswoman has declined to confirm the meeting. But this shows that TSMC is very important to U.S. economy because it is the world's largest contract chip maker and it is the exclusive supplier of chips to Apple's flagship flagship devices, including iPhones and MacBooks. Without TSMC's output or the imports of TSMC's chips to U.S. companies like AMD and NVIDIA, the U.S. economy could come to a halt. So it is a bit worrying what's going to happen when China is going to hold a live fire drill encircling Taiwan later this week after Pelosi departs.
Debbie, thanks so much for your update there on the impact on the tech sector, especially in Taiwan. Let's discuss this more now about the outlook for Taiwan's semiconductor sector. Bring in Sebastian Ho, Senior Investment Analyst at Neuberger Berman, Taiwan. Sebastian, always great to have you. How do you see this meeting and tensions over Taiwan really impacting the supply chain issues revolving semiconductors here moving forward?
Good morning. Thanks for having me again. Yes, good morning. Thanks for having me again. I think the geopolitical tension, Beijing's response overnight. So I think the supply chain already been disrupted in the past 2 years. But if Taiwan is going to be locked down, surrounded by the Beijing military in the coming later weeks, based on this announcement, I think that will most likely to affect the chip export from Taiwan. So but we don't know how long it will last. But for the short period of time, we could expect some of the chips that are manufactured by the TSMC will have some problem to be shipped out to the U.S. customers, including NVIDIA, AMD, or even Apple, Qualcomm, these semiconductor giants in the U.S. and not just U.S. but globally. Consumer electronics, car, data centers will all be potentially affected if that lockdown persists for longer.
Sebastian, David here. So while we do try and figure out what potential disruptions might be, and by the way, it may or may not happen. If it happens, potentially big. What's the underlying forces at work right now within the sector in terms of? Let's talk about inventories. So let's go there. Are we continuing to see a drawdown in inventories?
The inventory actually correction control has already started since last quarter among supply chain. If you look at the inventory data, or days on inventory, this ratio, it has already shot up to the record high, and to some extent is even higher than the pre-dot-com bubble level that 2 decades ago. So if you look at that number, it's kind of scary. And right now we have a macro slowdown, so which means that the inventory correction is inevitable. Supply chain has started yet, but we think that they will continue to last for a few quarters. I think the TSMC or some of their companies in the recent earnings call release, they talk about this inventory will persist for like 2 to 3 quarters, at least from their perspective. So yeah, I think that's something that we're going to go through probably until the first half of next year before this whole inventory be cleared out.
Sebastian, just hold that thought for a second, because we're getting more lines out of this meeting taking place between the President of Taiwan and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. They're saying at the moment, at least the Taiwanese President, they're going to strengthen their self-defense capability. At the moment saying that they continue to work with the United States on Indo-Pacific security, naturally here as well, and that they would not back down to a heightened military threat here as well. Meanwhile, Central Bank Governor talking about there being sufficient foreign exchange reserves there as well for the territory. Sebastian, you know, we look at what's happening and the response we've just had from China with regards to, one of the things was, of course, this export ban on sand. So they're not going to be sending sand. How does that affect the semi side of things?
Well, I think the impacts will be, I think the Taiwan will be able to source those sand from the other regions. And overall, that doesn't account for much of the semiconductor manufacturing. I think the key thing is the silicon wafers, and then they can source that from the Japan and also Taiwanese makers and Germany. So I think that wouldn't be so far we haven't seen that as as a key hurdles or threat to the overall semiconductors or tech supply chain.
Sebastian, hold on a second here. We are expected to hear right now the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi stepping up the podium to speak. Let's listen in.
Great immense admiration for your leadership and great personal humility that I accept this award. Humility because I accept it not for me only, but for our members of Congress who are so instrumental in all that you said about our accomplishments together. Democrats and Republicans, House and Senate, both sides of the aisle, united in our support for Taiwan. This time I am so excited to receive this award on behalf of the United States Congress. As I said, it is just unwavering. The response that we had to our visit was so positive from our colleagues. I look forward to displaying this award in the Speaker's office. We're wearing it there. In the Capitol as a symbol of our treasured friendship.
谢谢总统阁下，非常荣幸能够接受特种青年大绶勋章的颁赠，也非常荣幸，我也为总统的女性的领导的力量，以及我自己身为女性的领导人为荣。那当然，我这次能够获颁这个勋章，我是非常虚心接受的。会说虚心，是因为我不只是代表我自己，也代表整个美国的。我们这次来访的所有的美国的议员们一起来接受这份勋章，而且这些一同一行的议员们呢，其实对于刚刚讲到所有的对于台美关系的贡献呢，其实他们都有尽一份力，而且我们这样子的贡献，无论是民主党、共和党，无论在众议院、参议院，大家都是团结一致，有了高度的共识的。那我也非常的兴奋，能够代表整个众议院呢，代表整个美国政府能够接受这样子的一个勋章。我也很期待能够把大绶青年勋章带回去，展示在我的办公室当中。毕竟我在办公室并不会穿戴整个大绶。
Madam President, I think it's important to remind some and inform others of how we are here. 43 years ago, with the Taiwan Relations Act, America made a bedrock promise to always stand with Taiwan. And on this strong foundation, we have built a thriving partnership, grounded in our shared values of self-government and self-determination, focused on our mutual security interests in the region and across the world, committed to the economic ties that power prosperity for all of our people.
我们这一次的来访呢，其中一项重点就是要提醒大家并告知大家，43年前我们通过了《台湾关系法》，当时就许下了对台湾非常坚定的承诺，要与台湾站在一起。在这个基础之上，我们形成了非常繁荣的合作关系跟伙伴关系。我们的焦点不但是有包括我们的共同命运的自觉，还有许多我们共同安全的议题，无论是在这个地区还是全世界的共同安全，以及我们必须要保障我们，并且深化我们的经济关系，使得我们的两国的人民能够有更好的生活。
Today, our delegation, which I'm very proud, came to Taiwan to make unequivocally clear we will not abandon our commitment to Taiwan, and we are proud of our enduring friendship. And may I mention, they're all co-chairs of this delegation. The chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Gary Meek of Illinois, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Takano of California, the vice chair of the Ways and Means Committee, Congresswoman Del Bene of Washington State, the member of the Intelligence Committee, a leader in COVID fighting and so many things in the Congress, Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy from, I say Illinois, he says Chicago. And again, one of our newest members of Congress, served in the diplomat, as a diplomat in the State Department before coming, Congressman Andy Kim, of not only the Armed Services Committee, but also the Foreign Affairs Committee and others. We're very proud of our delegation, and when you hear, as you'll be hearing from them in the course of our visit, you will know even more why we are. Thank you to our delegation. And we're proud to be here with the Vice President, with Mr. Wu, and other distinguished leaders who are here with you, Madam President. Thank you for your leadership. The story of Taiwan is an inspiration to all freedom-loving people in the United States and around the world. Out of a crucible of challenge, you have forged a flourishing democracy, one of the freest in the world, proudly to be led by a woman president. That's an applause line.
我们这一次访团非常荣幸能够来到台湾，我们要必须向外界宣示，我们非常清楚的表达，我们绝对不会背弃对台湾的承诺。这次来访的许多议员们，他们也都是在各委员会当中担任主席或副主席或其他的要职，例如说外交委员会的主席里克斯，退伍军人事务委员会的主席高野，速记委员会的副主席戴碧妮，情报委员会以及防疫许多方面的贡献者克里绪纳莫提。军事委员会以及外交委员会的成员金安迪等等，他们都非常荣幸能够来到台湾，也非常感谢这些议员们跟我随行一起来访。那我也很高兴，也很荣幸能够在这边见到副总统、文部长，以及蔡总统，以及非常许多杰出的台湾的政治领导者，非常感谢各位的领导。那台湾的故事呢，其实就是一群热爱自由民主的人民的故事。那其实我们在美国也在全世界都有许多这样子热爱自由的人民。
And Taiwan has been an island of resilience in the world. Indeed, the people of Taiwan have proven to the world that with hope, courage, and determination, it is possible to build a peaceful and prosperous future, even in terms of the challenges you face. And now, more than ever, America's solidarity with Taiwan is crucial, and that is the message we are bringing here today.
台湾是一个韧性之岛，台湾的人民也向外界证明了，只要有希望、有勇气、有决心，一定能够打造一个和平又繁荣的未来。尽管台湾面临着这么多的严峻的挑战，那美国与台湾的团结也非常的重要。我们这一次来访，就是要向外界彰显像这样子的美台之间的团结。
When we travel and leave the country as a congressional delegation, security, protect our people as well as global security, economy to spread prosperity in our own country and others, and governance are three principal pillars of our travel. In all three areas, we have great cooperation and friendship with Taiwan, and we value that. I just do want to mention and congratulate Taiwan for your governance of the COVID issue, the COVID pandemic. You're a model to the world in terms of the cooperation of the people and the success of your initiatives. Congratulations, Madam President. Congratulations to the people of Taiwan for following the lead and suggesting their own proposals. Today, the world faces a choice between democracy and autocracy. America's determination to preserve democracy here in Taiwan and around the world remains ironclad. And we're grateful to the partnership of the people of Taiwan in this mission. I'm very grateful to receive this award. I'm grateful to you, Madam President, to the people for their enduring friendship. I'm very blessed, as are my colleagues, with many Taiwan Americans who are very excited about our visit. And in fact, when I came before, in '99, I came with them, and we learned a lot. And that's what we came to do, to participate in the Asian Pacific Initiative in a way that is appropriate for Taiwan to be successful, whether in trade, security, etc., and to do so in a way that opens many more possibilities. We came here to listen, to learn, and what do you know? I got this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful award. The Order of Propitious Clouds with Special Grand Hodom. Thank you, Madam President. Thank you so much.
这一次我们访问亚洲各国， 我们有3大支柱，3个主要的重点，一个就是安全，人民的安全，全球的安全；经济，也就是说我们要创造未来的繁荣，能够加惠更多的人，以及治理。
Okay, we're going to leave those scenes in Taipei.
At the moment, Nancy Pelosi there having just accepted an award. She's right, just said that she was there essentially to reinforce that the United States would not abandon Taiwan, ultimately saying also that that what we have at the moment is solidarity with Taiwan, and is going on to say that that is in essence something which is of, should I say, at the moment vital and a necessity here as well, saying it's crucial. Okay, and we have a change of who I'm with at the moment, and let's get over now to Juliet Sally. Jules.
Yeah, good morning, Rish, or good evening where you are. But of course, we are very closely watching what Nancy Pelosi is saying here, the US House Speaker visiting Taiwan despite the warnings from China. Let's bring in Chief North Asia correspondent Steve Engel with us in Hong Kong for his take on this. And Steve, we're watching very closely what Nancy Pelosi has said. She's made it very, very clear here in terms of the fact that the US solidarity with Taiwan is crucial, and saying that was a key reason as to why she decided to visit Taiwan, despite, of course, the fact that there were quite a lot of warnings that perhaps she shouldn't. What are you seeing in terms of her speech and I guess the economic consequences of some of the responses we've seen from China so far?
Well, I think her speech so far with Tsai Ing-wen there has gone to plan, as I expected. The many pleasantries, and she did receive that Medal of Honor from Tsai Ing-wen, Taiwan, one of the highest honors to give out. So she was very appreciative of that. There was nothing ground-shaking in her speech other than to reaffirm, what the reason she came here for, and that is to reaffirm the U.S. commitment under the Taiwan-U.S. Relations Act and show solidarity to the democracy that has flourished in Taiwan. Again, China is going to continue to say that they oppose this visit, and in fact, there was a headline that came across while Pelosi was speaking, essentially saying China warning that President Tsai Ing-wen is pushing Taiwan to a disastrous abyss. This according to Xinhua News Agency. So expected responses by China, expected comments by Nancy Pelosi.
Steve, hold that thought because we're going to get back to Sebastian Hode from Neuberger Berman, Taiwan. And just, she's going to go and talk apparently to TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor here. What does that really represent to you in terms of the wider context of the Taiwanese semiconductor industry?
Yeah, I think it is amplifies the importance of the TSMC or the whole semiconductor industry supply chain in Taiwan to the U.S. and to the global economy. I think we cannot emphasize more about how the Taiwan semiconductor industry and the TSMC, it's pretty critical to a lot of the U.S. tech, and even not just tech, even software or internet, and everyday our life company, even the car makers. And because TSMC controls 60% of the global semiconductor foundry market share, and if some of the high-end advanced technologies, it has dominated with over 90% plus market share. So I think we see that the Taiwan semiconductor industries has increasing their investments in the U.S. in recent years. I think the tie between the U.S. and Taiwan on the semiconductor front is hard to unbundle. So that's why I think that this trip, simply from semiconductor tech supply chain perspective, I think it just underscores the importance of this and how the U.S. government potentially value the TSMC, the Taiwan semiconductor contribution to the U.S.
Sebastian, okay, now if China decides to do more in terms of, I mean, we've got this, we talked about it earlier, the export ban on sand. They can source that elsewhere, but they can do other things which may make life difficult for companies like TSMC. You know, what does that do to an industry which has had a lot of supply chain issues? But are those supply chain issues going back on the back burner? Because, I mean, after COVID and during COVID, we saw such high demand for things like PCs that that's something which has fallen off a cliff now.
Yeah, I think in terms of semiconductor industry itself, I think globally and not just Taiwan, the dependence on China is very low. In terms of the materials, in terms of the chemical, in terms of silicon wafers, equipment, IP, most of this is actually originated in the US and Japan and Europe, and now Taiwan as well. So we don't expect much of the impacts or measures, countermeasures that from China on the semiconductor part. But in terms of the tech supply chain, then there will potentially be some uncertainty because a lot of the tech downstream manufacturing, for example, the Apple's iPhone, MacBook, the assembly, manufacturing plants, a lot of that is still in China, even if those assemblers are trying to move out of China in recent years because of the geopolitical tensions, but still, China still account for the big base for the manufacturing. So just as thinking, so that's where the potential uncertainty will come from. Yeah.
Sebastian, it's Juliet in Singapore. I just also wanted to ask you what the potential impact to Korea and Korean chip makers could be amid the escalating tension between the US and Taiwan. And China, I should say, over Taiwan.
Well, I think South Korea, the strength in South Korea chip making is mainly in the memory, DRAM, and NAND flash. While it's actually quite complement to the strength in Taiwan on the foundry side, which is on the logic and analog semis. So while there could be some competition, but I think there's more collaboration from the global supply chain perspective. So if you look at the Chip 4, which is proposed by the U.S. government for Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the U.S. on the semiconductor alliance, something like that. Actually, we don't see much of the overlap. It's more of a collaboration between the four countries. So speaking with looking at the South Korea and Taiwan, I would see the more collaboration of supply chain rather than competition. So yeah, I don't see much of the conflicts here.
Hey, Sebastian, Steve Engel here in Hong Kong. I just want to jump in here real quick and ask you a question about how much of a game changer you think the congressional bill that passed supplying about $52 billion in incentives for domestic chip making in the United States. That's over a 5-year period. Does that change the game much for TSMC in how it views its plant that they're building in Arizona and perhaps future plants on the same site? Keep in mind, TSMC has annual capex this year of about $44 billion in just 1 year. Does $52 billion to the whole industry over 5 years change that equation for TSMC to invest more in the United States?
Well, that's a good question. But if you look at this subsidy or Congress bill, it has been talked about for, I remember, like 2 years or even longer. But I think that TSMC has already started or announced to build a plant in the U.S. in the Arizona state quite long ago, and they continue to execute that in the past, I think, the 12, 18 months, regardless of the bill get passed or not. So I think the bill that passed is definitely positive for TSMC because it can potentially be eligible for applying for some subsidy, so that could go for its profit. But with or without that, it looks like TSMC has already pretty determined to invest in the U.S. And you point out that the numbers comparison, the $52 billion versus TSMC annual capex $44 billion, it's not big enough, and that $50 billion have to spread out into multiple manufacturing design companies. So I think there's some part where that may potentially get to TSMC, but I think TSMC that Taiwan still is home base. U.S. they will increase investment, but going forward, look at the proportion of the manufacturing base. I would say that Taiwan will still be the majority, but the U.S. part will increase, but it's still not a major part of the total manufacturing.
All right, Sebastian Hao from Neuberger Berman, Taiwan. Thank you so much for sticking around for us. And Steve, just want to come back to you as we have heard Nancy Pelosi's initial remarks conclude here. And really, I think the key takeaway as we look back on what she mentioned is the fact that she has said that this trip was really to make it clear that the U.S. is not going to abandon Taiwan.
Absolutely. I mean, there was nothing earth-shattering or earth-shaking, I should say, from Nancy Pelosi's comments, full of pleasantries as she received that Medal of Honor award from President Tsai Ing-wen. She did say, though, what I expected her to say, and that the United States stands by its commitment under the U.S.-Taiwan Relations Act to support Taiwan, despite the pressure that it receives from mainland China. So now they're behind closed doors. Now they're getting into the meat and potatoes of the real discussions, and perhaps they're going to talk more about the chip industry and the like, and what the possible response from China is going to be and has been so far. But at least publicly, it was full of pleasantries, even though China's Xinhua news agency posted a number of comments while Pelosi and while Tsai Ing-wen were speaking, condemning Pelosi's visit, as well as saying Tsai Ing-wen is pushing Taiwan towards a dangerous abyss. Again, similar kind of verbiage coming from Beijing. It is not pleased at all with this visit by Nancy Pelosi, especially considering that she is second in line to the presidency after the vice president and then the House Speaker.
Steve, I was going to ask you that very thing. You know, it's not, as you said, there's pleasantries going on in Taipei. There's certainly not pleasantries coming out of Beijing. You know, what is the reaction, the scale of the reaction from China thus far? How are people gauging that?
Well, I think, of course, there's the economic side, and there's been a few bans of various trades of sand, industrial sand, as well as some fruit imports from Taiwan, citrus fruits and fish. Fairly small response, actually, but there's also been some movements on trade with some 100 Taiwanese companies. We also saw news earlier that CATL, perhaps because of this this visit by Pelosi, that's, of course, the big mainland Chinese electric car battery maker, will postpone a potential announcement for an investment in the United States. So that's on the economic side. The military side, they've been very vociferous about saying that they're going to continue with these military exercises, and they're going to have 6 exclusive zones surrounding the island of Taiwan starting tomorrow, where they'll conduct military drills. CCTV, the state broadcaster, has already indicated that joint naval and Air Force divisions of the PLA have begun military drills as a show of force. There's been live fire activity coming off the coast of Fujian, directly across the Taiwan Strait from Taiwan. So this kind of, some would call it saber rattling, will continue. Keep in mind, back in 1995, when the first democratically elected president of Taiwan, Lee Teng-hui, went to the United States, China had a similar type response. They had exclusion zones, military operations going on for several months. And that did disrupt marine trade and shipping lanes and also air travel. So this could be an offshoot of this as well going forward, depending on how long Beijing wants to continue this kind of pressure, so-called gray zone tactics, in lieu, obviously, of the worst case scenario would be some sort of direct military confrontation.
Steve Engel there, our chief North Asia correspondent. All right, let's tell you what we've got coming up later this hour. Going to get the outlook for Chinese equities. Lorraine Tan from Morningstar joins us. She's got a state-owned property developer among her top stock picks. We'll ask why on earth does she? Plus, more on Pelosi's historic and controversial trip to Taiwan and the economic curbs we've been talking about that Beijing has instituted and unleashed against Taipei. This is Bloomberg.
ช็อปปลอดภัยกับบัตรที่คุณคอนโทรลได้บัตร B-First Digital ธนาคารกรุงเทพ
Most of us don't spend much time thinking about the grid, the dizzyingly huge system of cables, transformers and outlets that reliably powers our lives. It's an easily ignored, change-resistant part of the modern world, and that's the way we like it. But as we move towards less planet-melting ways of producing electricity, the grid is going to have to evolve too.
We are seeing so many countries and governments announcing high targets when it comes to decarbonization and being climate neutral. But this is just one side of the coin. It's not enough to simply generate green energy. We also need to make sure that this is transmitted and distributed to the end consumers.
The grid of today just isn't equipped for renewables. So a new kind of grid is starting to take shape. The supergrid.
This is Bloomberg Markets. We've got three Federal Reserve officials sending one powerful message. Their number one priority remains bringing down inflation, and there's still a long way to go. Kathleen Hayes is our global economics and policy editor. And Kathleen, I mean, the Fed speak crushed widespread market bets that it would pivot and start fighting recession. But what did they say exactly and why? Because it was really a statement of intent.
Which, in my view, has not changed. The Fed has had one single message. What has happened is people in the markets, investors, traders, have decided, well, gee, if the economy is slowing down, there's going to be a recession, the Fed's going to have to stop doing this. Now, in fairness to many of those people, they haven't been around long enough to just look back to say, the 1970s and 80s when Paul Volcker had to crush inflation with a recession, because we haven't been there, right? So in terms of what they said and why, Loretta Mester, for example, president of the Cleveland Fed, saying that there's more to be done, that the economy isn't really in a recession, it's going below trend, but that's what you need to bring down inflation. So that's one set of views. And then, of course, you had Mary Daly, president of the San Francisco Fed, who said nowhere near being done with the inflation fight. CPI is at 9% year over year. The target's 2%. We've made some progress. We have further to go. Charlie Evans, he's president of the Chicago Fed. Pretty specific. I like the fact that he answered a question saying, well, 50 or 75 basis points possibly again at the September meeting. But after that, he said, we're going to do, I think, 25 basis point hikes in November and December. This is what he's predicted for a while. This whole concept, I think, of front loading, making a difference, and seeing what happens to inflation then. He says there may be a couple more next year. So that's the gist of it. And of course, there's what Jim Bullard said here in New York City today.
Yep, and there were a few more speakers too, Kathleen. So just how specific on what is needed in that inflation fight were the likes of Loretta Mester, of course, other members as well, like Daly and Evans?
Well, I think I just summed up Mester, Daly, and Evans pretty much for you. And again, I think it's interesting, too, that at one time Evans and Mester were both considered doves. And here they are. The hawkishness has really coalesced because I think the job is so clear. You don't have to think too hard about what you have to do. Jim Bullard was speaking at the Money Marketeers of New York University today, and he said that he thinks that they actually are going to have to get restrictive, continue to get restrictive, 3.5% to 4% on the funds rate by the end of the year. But he too said, then we're going to start watching the data more. And maybe if inflation surprised me, it was worse than I thought in the second quarter, he said, and we may have to do a bit more. But he's also in the camp that's saying maybe we will slow down. He's also insisting there won't be a recession. He gave a very academic presentation about the Fed having more credibility than the Fed did when Paul Volcker stepped in and had to cool off that red-hot inflation. And because they have that credibility, because inflation expectations out of control, he still thinks, Jules, that they can pull off the soft landing without the recession.
All right, Global Economics and Policy Editor Kathleen Hayes with us in New York. Let's get more on market action now with Lorraine Tan, Director of Asia Equity Research at Morningstar, who joins me here on the Singapore set. Lorraine, great to have you with us. We do want to get your thoughts on what we heard Kathleen mention about some of that Fed speak. But let's start with what we're seeing in market action today, and it certainly seems a lot more sanguine, even though we do have Nancy Pelosi in Taiwan. She's made it very clear in the last half hour that the US is really trying to stand with Taiwan. Your take here?
Yeah, I think the markets are obviously a lot more relaxed because we didn't see an explosion of whatever yesterday or last night. And I think in reality, it just is, so far as it's mainly just speak, I think that's okay. We just don't want to see an escalation of that.
Yeah, absolutely. But we are watching very closely what is going to mean for the chip players, particularly with Nancy Pelosi tipped to meet with TSMC. Does this change the outlook, or I guess what kind of reliance you could see from China on some of these chip makers too?
No, I don't think that's changed because China has already mentioned that it would like to develop its own industry. It obviously wants to reduce reliance on wherever they think there are risks. So I don't think that changes China's game plan at all. At the same time, I think there's no choice but to rely on TSMC, for example, going forward because of the fact that it does have a technology advantage.
All right, Lorraine, I mean, the thing is, how does this all really play out with regards to your strategy and how you're looking at what's happening fundamentally on a macro level and indeed a micro one, actually, in terms of sector picks and that morphing into, of course, individual companies?
I think for us, I mean, it's very difficult to factor sort of geopolitical risks. So we're focused on is where the valuations are at the moment, and we still see the markets as relatively cheap compared to our fair value estimates. In fact, Asian markets are probably, currently trading at about a 16% discount overall to our fair value estimate. So we do think that there is opportunities out there, particularly in, say, the sectors that have been sold down the most. That would still be technology and consumer discretionary. And we think that sort of, it factors already in the potential downturn, into global growth as well.
Lorraine, okay, when we look at some of these companies which have been under such pressure, give us a sense of, the likes of Alibaba, for instance. I think you're turning more positive there.
Yes, we are. I just think because of the quality, when we look at, obviously risks with inflation, with slowdowns and et cetera, and geopolitical risks, of course, as well. What we do like in terms of the China e-commerce names is that there is some abatement in regulatory risks, which we see to be positive overall. Basically, recently there were more games announced, so we do have we do think that there's value in the strong cash flows that they have, and they're very much a domestic story still. So that's the reason why we still like Tencent and Alibaba.
All right, Lorraine, just stick with us. Lorraine Tan from Morningstar. We do want to get to our Greater China Senior Executive Editor, John Liu, for his take on what we've heard from Nancy Pelosi in Taiwan, those initial remarks, John, and of course what the outcome is likely to be from the Beijing side.
Well, the thing that Speaker Pelosi has said that sticks out most at this point is that the U.S. will not abandon Taiwan. I think that sort of underlines what she has conveyed as the importance of her trip. Obviously, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there has been increased concern in the U.S., especially that China might take some steps, potentially an incursion into Taiwanese territory, and that the U.S. needs in turn to strengthen Taiwan's defenses. That has been the U.S. case for why Ms. Pelosi needed to make this visit. She is underlining that today.
John, it gives a sense of the mood there, because there's a sense of disappointment that so far the measures that Beijing has come up with are not going far enough to satisfy some people in some quarters.
So prior to Ms. Pelosi's visit, China did a lot to try and I would say discourage the visit from happening. That included a lot of commentary on Chinese social media from people like the former editor of the Global Times, Mr. Hu Xijing, saying things such as that potentially PLA jets could escort Ms. Pelosi's planes that tried to land in Taiwan, maybe stop her from landing. And so that sort of elevated the expectation of what sort of response we might see from Beijing when Speaker Pelosi did try to make that visit. Obviously, that did not happen. We did get a very strong response from China. They are going to be holding live fire drills around and circling essentially Taiwan. That is a very provocative action. There are missile tests that are supposed to happen today. We're watching out for those. But still, at the same time, domestically here in China, the reaction that the government took fell short of what some expectations had gone to in terms of social media.
John, I also wanted to ask you the impact of the broader security in the region too. I mean, we're awaiting to hear updates coming through from Australia and other nations in the Asia Pacific too. What are you kind of expecting here?
I think that the relationship between the U.S. and China, obviously, I think very arguably the most important in the world at this moment, has taken a turn for the worse. What used to be a conflict over trade, over technology, is now becoming more and more so one that is a military competition in some ways. We have jets, we have missiles, we have carrier groups around the region navigating, we have live fire drills, and I would expect the United States would take some sort of military action in response to that. And so it is becoming a much more dangerous situation, I think, especially for the neighbors in the region, Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, Japan, Korea. And I think the concern, if not expressed publicly, I would expect would be expressed privately to Washington in the next coming days.
All right, always great to have you with us, John Liu, in Beijing. Let's get more on market action with Lorraine Tan, Director of Asia Equity Research at Morningstar, still with us here on the Singapore set. Just noting from one of our MLive bloggers that early gains across Hong Kong and Chinese equities are being erased as Nancy Pelosi speaks in Taipei. Mark Cranfield saying they may have preferred some silence from Pelosi, but we're just getting back to some of your top picks that you see, because we did see an underperformance in China in July quite heavily, but you're still kind of positive here on property stocks.
I'm not sure we are completely positive on all property stocks. We do think that there needs to be a lot more done within the China real estate space to reinstill confidence, and that needs to be done in order to sort of support the home buyer to come back. So to prevent things from worsening. So, but we do need to see support for the financial sector in terms of enabling the real estate companies to go back to find some funding. And there obviously needs to be support for the consolidation that we anticipate. Where we are positive is that we do expect some of the Hong Kong real estate companies to recover.
Because, so selective then. So tell me why Swire Properties, for example.
Well, mainly because of the fact that we think the COVID lockdowns in Hong Kong are the worst is behind us, hopefully. And as Hong Kong reopens, which I think it will have to, that's where we see the retail space, the office space coming back in terms of rent for most of the Hong Kong real estate companies. And we do like Swire for its assets and its long history of management.
Well, what about this whole debacle with the property side of things there in China? Now, of course, with what's been going on in the streets, people refusing to pay for houses which haven't been built and haven't been built for years, and having these mortgage boycotts and other also sanctions put on banks. Now, how worried are you about the banking system?
Well, we did an exercise looking at the risks. We do feel that most of definitely the larger banks and the banking system at large are strong enough, because while we are seeing pockets of delays in some projects, that's not completely widespread enough to dampen, I think, or bring the financial crisis to China. We may see an increase in bad debt provision, perhaps by 1%. Let's say. So yes, there is some dampening factor in terms of loans growth and asset quality, but not enough, I think, to sort of belly up the system. So in that regard, we're probably a little bit less worried, but we definitely do want to see more measures made to reinstill confidence.
Lorraine, that brings us nicely to talk a little bit about, the biggest headwind that the Chinese economy faces, and as a result, many of these companies, and that's these COVID lockdowns. That's something that you're watching, no doubt, with a lot of interest.
Yeah, I mean, we would have expected. I mean, at the end of the day, what we're seeing is with with the latest policies that were announced at the end of June, the policies are a little bit more contained in that sense. We don't, although the BA.5 variant is going to increase the number of cases, what we're hoping to see is fewer impact from the chaos of the lockdowns that we saw in the second quarter. So in that sense, rather than an entire neighborhood being locked down, we may just see one building being locked down if there's a case there. So I think that will be a lot more manageable. What we have noticed is that the subway ridership for Shanghai and Beijing are rebounding still, which has been interesting, despite the fact that there have been cases from time to time.
Lorraine, what about the themes here in terms of reopening across ASEAN, which is much further ahead than what we're seeing in China and Hong Kong? Has that all been priced in, or are there still opportunities to be had here?
I think there's select opportunities still, because I think, let's say, for example, we think that there's still some of the REITs that we like here in Singapore, CICG Capital Land, for example, commercial trusts, for example, that we like. And I think although these have been sold down, they've been sold down because of the interest rate hikes that we've been seeing, and that's going to continue for a little while. But I think if we look ahead to where the values are in terms of the rental reversions that we're seeing, so we do feel that there's still opportunity.
Yeah. What do you actually absolutely stay away from right now, Lorraine?
Well, definitely, I think where we would stay away from is certain definitely one of the things that we have uncertainty over is those companies, ADRs, for example, in the States, that haven't gotten back any home listing yet in Hong Kong or China, for example. That's going to be challenging, I think, to resolve to get the PCAOB audits done on time. So there's a real dampener there. So it's going to take some time for some of those companies to come back. For example, we do like a biotech company, IMAB, but unless it can move or shift its auditing to US, and that depends on whether it's got business primarily in the States. It's going to be difficult not to see these companies facing some delisting pressure.
All right, Lorraine, thank you for coming in. Lorraine Tan is Director of Asia Equity Research at Morningstar with us here in Singapore. Let's head to New York now and get the first word news with Vonnie Quinn. Hey, Vonnie.
Hey, Julia, thank you. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has reaffirmed U.S. support for Taiwan despite fresh threats of military action by China. Pelosi made her comments at a ceremony with President Tsai Ing-wen, who said the visit showed staunch international support for the island. Pelosi is the highest-ranking American official to visit Taiwan in 25 years.
Today, our delegation, which I'm very proud, came to Taiwan to make unequivocally clear we will not abandon our commitment to Taiwan, and we are proud of our enduring friendship.
Well, China has imposed economic restrictions on Taiwan following House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit. It's halting natural sand exports as well as some fish and fruit from the island. Beijing is also conducting missile tests and military drills encircling Taiwan, some of its most provocative actions in decades. Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen says the island won't bow to pressure from Beijing.
Facing deliberately heightened military threats, Taiwan will not back down. We will firmly uphold our nation's sovereignty and continue to hold the line of defense for democracy.
Meantime, Federal Reserve officials say they want to see strong evidence inflation is on a sustainable downward path before declaring victory. San Francisco Fed President Mary Daly, Cleveland's Loretta Mester, and Chicago's Charles Evans all hinted the Fed still has a ways to go on reaching price stability. Well, with consumer prices rising 9.1% in June, Mester says slower growth may be necessary to control inflation.
We don't talk about recession per se. It's are we growing below or above trend? And, my forecast for this year is that we'll be growing below trend, but that's necessary in order to get
price increases, inflation under control.
Shanghai has posted no new COVID cases for a third straight day. It's the city's longest stretch of zero infections since a 5-day COVID-free streak ended last month. However, residents are still required to take frequent tests as officials seek to stamp out any flare-up. The local government will also conduct 2 rounds of mass testing in 5 of its 16 districts this week. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Vonnie Quinn. This is Bloomberg. Rish,
thanks, Bonnie. Let's check in on some of the airlines that we are watching in the Asian session, because China has warned airlines to avoid areas near Taiwan as it is conducting military exercises in response to US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to the island. We saw an official notice sent late on Tuesday, Hong Kong time, designating 6 areas of airspace as danger zones. This according to carriers who received the message. And we are seeing a little bit of weakness coming through in some of these Korean airways like EVA, and then China Airlines is down by about 1.4%. You're also looking at some of the reaction to shipping stocks, Rish.
Yeah, absolutely, because, I mean, the Taiwan Straits does represent a huge amount of traffic, which goes through something nearly 90% of some of the biggest ships in the world as you go through it. And I only learned the other day that the difference between a ship and a boat is, Jules, that ships carry boats and boats don't carry ships. There you go.
And I apparently got some of those airlines mixed up too. I'm very sorry about that. That is actually a Taiwanese carrier that we were talking about. All right, coming up, Bloomberg has learned that Chinese EV battery maker CATL is pushing back on announcing plans for a North American chip factory as tensions between Beijing and Washington escalate. We will have more on that next. This is Bloomberg.
Shop ออนไลน์แบบมั่นใจบัตร Be First Digital ธนาคารกรุงเทพ
You will put a woman on Mars. You will bring forth global cooling. Because when you subscribe to Bloomberg, you won't just get news. You will get insight into limitless possibilities. Before you change the world, Bloomberg.
No one covers the world like Bloomberg.
There's a sense it'll get to 7% in the coming months. Do you see that coming true?
Federal Reserve, of course, raising interest rates by 75 basis points again.
Where are the job cuts to come from? We will not just cut and run.
With unmatched reach and resources from more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, your global business authority. Politics to the world of business. Balance of Power with David Weston. News, analysis, insight from and about politics power players. Weekdays. This is Bloomberg.
I think that it's hard to put your head around any narrative. Let's just be honest. We've had sort of a shift in, are we in some sort of stagflation fears moment? People were talking about that all day yesterday.
Just checking, that's the scene at the moment of the streets of Taiwan. Very hot at the moment, a bit of a heat wave. We've got the TWSC, the benchmark, just at the moment bucking the regional trend by moving to the downside. We have a Taiwanese dollar now again below that psychologically important 30 level. Taiwan Semiconductor in focus as Nancy Pelosi's controversial visit to the island continues, and talk at the moment that she would be meeting with the head of the semiconductor manufacturer. That's what we have just now with regards to Taiwanese assets, as Nancy Pelosi said that her trip there was to prove to the people that she was, or the US would not abandon the island. Juliet.
And Bloomberg Rish has learned that Chinese EV battery maker CATL, or CATL, has decided to push back, announcing a multi-billion-dollar North American plant due to tensions raised by Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan. Let's get details from our managing editor for Asia Global Business, Emma O'Brien, who joins us from Sydney. I mean, this is quite a huge announcement. Emma, just tell us the reaction that we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, what we're hearing is that CATL was intending to make an announcement as soon as September, so next month, about where they decided to build this all-important North America plant. But given these tensions between the US and China, the fact nobody really knows where they might go, that they could intensify, they have hit the pause button and won't be making that announcement anytime soon. They were looking at about 3 sites, 2 actually in Mexico, but near the border with Texas, and 1 somewhere in the United States. It wasn't 100% clear where they were eyeing or where they might eventually settle. But it is a $5 billion project in terms of the investment CATL is eyeing up.
Tell me here, I mean, ultimately, when we look at what CATL is doing, you can't really throw politics out the window here, can you?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Is this just company's management, being cautious and wanting to see how this week plays out, whether it does intensify, whether this does become a very landmark moment where, relations shift for the worse permanently, or does it sort of fade away once Pelosi leaves and they can sort of circle back and resume what they're doing? That seems to be what's happening here, though I guess with China and Chinese companies, there's always this spectre of have they been told to do this? Is Beijing guiding this? But that's something we don't know.
It's interesting when we look at our Bloomberg Intelligence reaction to this. They're saying that this decision won't actually hurt cattle itself. But as you say, this is something that is taking investors at least by surprise. Do you expect that we could see more potential announcements like this from other companies?
Yeah, I mean, CATL was quite unusual in that it was a Chinese company that was looking at investing in the US. We have seen a lot of that tail off over the past couple of years as tensions have risen with the trade war initially, then with the virus, and then a lot of things sort of coming to the fore once the Biden administration came into government. So they were somewhat unusual, but there are a multitude of Chinese companies with operations in the US and vice versa. I mean, you only have to look at Tesla, a big client of CATL's, and its footprint in China. It's set to be its biggest producing factory there in Shanghai. Do they get caught up in this? A lot of speculation around the way Beijing could retaliate. Could they go the nuclear option with sanctions against not just sort of US government officials, but US companies? I think all that is swirling around out there, and as a result, you've got nervous markets and nervous investors.
Indeed. All right, Managing Editor for Asia Global Business, Emma O'Brien, with us in Sydney. We are just getting some lines coming through across the Bloomberg terminal from Taiwan's Foreign Ministry commenting on China and what we have seen in terms of reaction to Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan. And the Foreign Ministry is saying that China's provocative acts actually challenge the international order. The Defence Ministry spokesperson commenting here on China in a briefing, saying that China's drills have sabotaged the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. And earlier we were talking, of course, about China's reaction too, in the fact that they actually warned airlines to avoid areas near Taiwan where they are conducting military exercises. So we are getting the reaction here from Taiwan, saying that the drills
put more meat on, of course, the bones of those pleasantries that they exchanged within the last hour. And essentially, Pelosi saying her visit was meant to show solidarity with Taiwan, as well as reaffirm Washington's commitment to Taiwan under the 1979 U.S.-Taiwan Relations Act, and that her visit would show that confirmation that the U.S. will still back Taiwan, despite what we've seen is rising pressure coming from mainland China. Speaking of that rising pressure, China is out with fresh warnings while those two people were talking in Taipei, in addition to already announced increase in military drills. The vice foreign minister in China says Tsai Ing-wen is pushing Taiwan towards what he called a dangerous abyss. China also now, as we've been reporting, warning global airlines to avoid flying through the so-called danger zones. Those are its words. These are the 6 exclusion zones that China has announced that they will be, encircling the island of Taiwan with 6 exclusion zones starting at midday tomorrow, Thursday, and that will go through midday on Sunday. So this will be after Pelosi is scheduled to leave, but they will conduct military exercises. They've also talked about live fire exercises coming through or across the Taiwan Strait, a number of different moves of joint exercises between the PLA Navy and the PLA Air Force as a show of disapproval, anger, if you will, of Pelosi's visit.
But Steve, I mean, there's a body of thought in China, some of the hawks, suggesting that this reaction that we've had out of Beijing doesn't go far enough.
Well, how far do you want them to go, Rish? Or I'm not saying you want them to go, but a fairly muted response, if you want to call it that. At least the markets are taking a bit of a sigh of relief, because you have to think about what the worst case scenario would have been. And of course, we heard in the run-up to this visit, or this rumored visit by Nancy Pelosi, that the PLA would not, that's the People's Liberation Army of China, of course, would not sit idly by. But so far, they have. There's not been any direct confrontation, and there was no direct confrontation with Nancy Pelosi flying in late last night, arriving just after 10 p.m. under the cover of darkness, yes, as well as a bit of a roundabout route from Kuala Lumpur. We do have a chart to show how Nancy Pelosi's plane avoided the 9-dash line that China claims to have sovereignty over that parts of the South China Sea, as well as, of course, the Taiwan Strait. Her plane avoided those potential hotspots and went through and over Borneo and then up the eastern coast of the Philippines and arriving in Taiwan, just in case, obviously.
Steve, John Liu was telling us earlier that this is, as we know, just very much exacerbating the US-China tension. Do you see what we saw in terms of some of the economical moves that we've seen from China so far as being potentially a little bit more consequential than many might have expected? And I guess we're looking at what else could happen here.
Well, I think there's likely to be more economic measures. So far, I think that some of the moves that they have announced have been fairly tame when, if you look at the broader scheme of things, as well as the bit of rhetoric that has been coming out of Beijing. They're essentially banning Taiwanese exports to China of Taiwanese citrus fruit, as well as some forms of fish. They're also going to ban the export from China to Taiwan of natural sand, which is used in construction, used partly in semiconductors, but again, as a guest we had on earlier saying, and just like China did back in 2007 when they banned the export of that sand to Taiwan, Taiwan goes to other suppliers. They went to the Philippines before. They'll likely go to other areas as well. The bigger question is, how long will these exclusion zones last around Taiwan, and the so-called gray zone tactics that China will employ to further isolate Taiwan after this visit by Pelosi. They will go likely to greater extremes to diplomatically and economically try to isolate Taiwan after a result of this trip.
Yeah, and you know what are the longer consequences? I mean, let's take a look at the medium term here, Steve, with regards to this trip itself. I mean, at the same time, you've got perhaps the biggest geopolitical conflict going on in Eastern Europe right now with China, which really has been seen as a putative ally of Moscow. But could this turn China into a true ally of China? Of Moscow, yes.
Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that. I didn't quite get what you're going at there. But again, there's a no limits relationship, according to Xi Jinping, with Moscow. But we need to take a step back because most military analysts would say that Moscow attacking Ukraine is far different kettle of fish than actually Beijing and the PLA readying and actually executing an invasion of an island like Taiwan, which is obviously perhaps far more strategic to the United States than perhaps Ukraine. I'm not downplaying the importance of Ukraine to the United States, but Taiwan is a critical cog in the semiconductor and tech supply chain, as well as that buffer that between China and the United States, obviously. So I think most analysts are saying China might talk tough militarily, but right now their best strategy perhaps to further isolate Taiwan economically and diplomatically would be the so-called gray area tactics, gray zone tactics, and that is perhaps choking off some of those supply chains or those waterways that will impact supply chains. Already, just in the last hour, we got a warning from Beijing, a warning global airlines not to fly across or near these 6 exclusive zones, and it really does surround Taiwan. And Taiwan and Hong Kong, that route, well, before the pandemic, was considered the golden route for many airlines like Cathay Pacific. Many flights a day travel through the airspace of Taiwan, including flights from Southeast Asia up to Japan and Northeast Asia and South Korea. So potentially this could have some impact.
Yeah, Steve, don't forget, I think it was back in the day when you couldn't actually fly directly from Taiwan into the mainland, that they had to stop here, and that made it, I think, the busiest city pair in the world at one point. But Steve, the thing is, some military strategists and even some political ones have been suggesting that it was better not to have this trip, ultimately, by Nancy Pelosi. It was better, perhaps, to show their support for Taipei, I'm talking about Washington here, by essentially bolstering the so-called porcupine defense of the island.
Yeah, the porcupine defense strategy is if you have enough spikes pointing up and you have missiles and armaments and this and that, it's much more difficult for Beijing to swallow that porcupine. Obviously, that's speaking in metaphors and analogies. The basic truth is Beijing ready to take Taiwan by force? It's extremely difficult to take a heavily fortified island, especially one that will be supported militarily. I'm not saying the United States is going to intervene in any attack from China, but they are bound, and Joe Biden, when he was in the region, did reaffirm this, that they would help supply arms to Taiwan for its defense if needed. So again, I think few people expected this visit by Pelosi to trigger an invasion by China to Taiwan. But again, it does further chill an already pretty frigid relationship between China and the United States, especially on mill-to-mill dialogue, military to military.
Steve, always great to get your insights. Steve Engel with us there in Hong Kong. We're just reiterating that we are waiting here for a press conference from the US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who has been visiting Taiwan. We heard her initial remarks earlier, and she is going to have this joint press conference with Taiwan's President Tsai, who Pelosi has met already with President Tsai, praising one of the world's freest societies. And as Steve mentioned, we have been seeing some reaction too from the Taiwan side. And Rish, we're watching some of the market reaction too to all of this, particularly as Steve just told us, China warned that airlines operating in Asia should avoid flying in areas around Taiwan where they are conducting these military operations.
Yeah, very, very busy. And of course, we've seen this standoff also, to some extent, also playing out when it comes to shipping as well. It's one of the biggest shipping lanes in the world, isn't it, Steve? We're talking about even a minor disruption in this neck of the woods can cause a massive ripple effect.
So some of those Taiwan-listed shipping companies like Yangming Marine as well as Evergreen Marine and others, they sunk yesterday. But today, the last time I had checked at least, they were rising, or albeit slightly. Again, I think there was a little bit of fear in the Taiwan market, obviously, yesterday on what potentially could happen with that Pelosi visit. And shipping companies were among the victims on the stock market yesterday. Some of those stocks are pairing those losses and rising. Even though the broader TAIEX, as you can see, the TWSE is down by 0.25% right now. But yeah, we'll be watching airlines, we'll be watching those shipping companies. And if you have to, look at the global inflation picture, any disruption to supply chains is going to further exacerbate that.
Steve, great stuff. Thanks for all that. Stephen Engel there, Chief North Asia Correspondent. Time in Hong Kong approaching midday. We've got the lunchtime break for the Hang Seng. We have at the moment also, of course, a time of 5 o'clock in the morning right here in London and 8 o'clock in the morning in Dubai, where it's time to get over to Yusuf Gemeladine for Bloomberg Daybreak Middle East. Yusuf.
Thanks, Rish. The coverage continues. Let's run you through some of the top stories we're watching.
Today, our delegation, of which I'm very proud, came to Taiwan to make unequivocally clear we will not abandon our commitment to Taiwan, and we are proud of our enduring friendship.
U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi becomes the highest-ranking American politician to visit Taiwan in 25 years. China responds by announcing missile tests and military drills.
Fed officials push back against the notion that they could pivot away from tightening, saying the battle against inflation is far from over.
OPEC Plus meets later. Traders wait to see whether the group will heed or snub the U.S. calls to boost supplies.
And earnings are due from Societe Generale this hour. Investors are eager for an update on the impact of the bank's Russia exit.
It's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. Warm welcome to the show. I'm Anas Cranney in Dubai.
And I'm Yusuf Gemeladine right alongside you. We have to admit that as investors continue to weigh U.S.-China tensions, especially with Taiwan being the focal point, that there's a level of resilience in these equity markets. Looking here at the rundown on the futures, we're seeing a little bit of that resilience getting priced in. Overnight, stocks were marginally lower, but on par when you look at some of the big calls. I'm looking at a note out from UBS Group. They're saying it's hard to see any meaningful upside in equities right now. Bank of America strategists say that the July stocks rebound was actually a bear market rally. We had downside surprises from Airbnb and AMD. Look out for earnings late in the day from Booking, Moderna, BMW, and Infineon. I want to flip the board and get some of the outflows as we begin to understand the magnitude of some of the dislocations in capital flows. This is a story of a net rolling 12-month outflows from Taiwanese stocks. That's topped $30 billion. Moments ago, the Taiwan Central Bank said that they're not concerned about these outflows. They're not concerned about the Taiwan dollar. But what we are seeing is we're seeing capital move into havens like the dollar. Because, yes, we're taking a bit of a moment to take a breath on the Bloomberg Dollar Index. But the Fed-fueled gains, right, with policymakers silencing the chatter about a possible moderation interest rate hikes, right, leading to this first up day in 5, the best day since July 11. At the moment on the Bloomberg Dollar Index, we are seeing just a little bit of downside, and that's going to be something to watch for the remainder of the day, Manus.
Well, an explosion in the bond markets, that's where the real risk was. There may not have been any malevolent forces at play because of Nancy Pelosi touching down in terms of market reaction, but the bond markets exploded. The 6th biggest explosion higher in yields on record in the 10-year, and the Fed are far from finished. Bullard makes the point, 3.75, 4% is where he wants to see rates. That's probably where we need to go to. Let's have a quick check at the bond markets, and you are seeing yields move this morning. Loretta Mester saying she needs compelling evidence, Yusuf, before she's prepared to curb the position that they have at the Fed. Liquidity is the worst since 2020. Let me just show you what's going on with the real yield. The explosion in nominal yields takes you into a real yield zone in the 5 and the 10-year tenor. Real yields popping back into positive territory. Let's have a look at the GTV in the library there in terms of the real yield. 5s and 10s are moving. What does that do to the risk narrative? It's OPEC day, as I said. You're off a 5-month low. Goldman's expect a modest supply hike from OPEC+. Let's have a look at the oil prices. We were dipping ever so slightly when I arrived at the office at 5 a.m. In terms of the oil market, we're still in negative territory. Ed Moore says $80 is on the way for WTI, the mid-80s, and Brent will trade at the 80 level by the end of the year. By the way, the busiest shipping lane in the world, 88% of the largest containers pass through Taiwan, and that has ramifications for a left-hand tail risk to global supply chains. Juliet Sally is in Singapore. She's been tracking Pelosi and the markets 2 for 1. Good morning, Jules.
Yeah, indeed, Manus. And certainly we're seeing weakness in Taiwan, which you can see reflected there at the bottom of the screen, falling for a third session as we see this unease and as Taiwan has also retaliated against China's moves in the Taiwan Strait. But as you can see across the rest of risk assets here in Asia, they're pretty good. And in fact, we've actually been seeing quite a bit of stabilisation coming through in markets too. Hong Kong certainly leading the gains. Where we have been seeing some weakness and some nervousness is in some of the shipping stocks, some of the airline stocks too. And this is after China warned airlines operating in Asia to avoid flying in areas around Taiwan where it is conducting these military exercises. When it comes to the overall China picture, look, we're still on watch about the property sector woes. Let's flip the board and have a look at my GTV, which is actually showing that China's CSI 300, which we were kind of touching on yesterday, is very much nearing that correction now, so down around 10% from its June peak. So this is, I guess, the kind of other key factor that investors here in Asia are watching out for, whether or not this market has become too frothy, and of course the ongoing concerns in the property sector. Manus.
Jules, thank you very much. So the US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has become the highest ranking American politician to visit Taiwan in a quarter of a century. She spoke during the last hour.
Today, our delegation, of which I'm very proud, came to Taiwan to make unequivocally clear we will not abandon our commitment to Taiwan, and we are proud of our enduring friendship.
Nancy Pelosi, we're going to go live to Nancy Pelosi. She is having a second press conference. Let's listen in.
Our President of the Republic, Dr. Tsai Ing-wen, to make her remarks.
Yes, I'd like to take this opportunity to reiterate the Taiwanese people's warm welcome to Speaker Pelosi and the delegation. We're grateful for the delegation's visit under such challenging circumstances as a demonstration of unwavering support to the people of Taiwan. The Speaker's presence here in Taiwan serves to boost public confidence in the strength of our democracy as a foundation to our partnership with the United States. I told Speaker Pelosi that we are committed to maintaining the status quo across the strait. Taiwanese people are pragmatic. We have welcomed many congressional delegations to Taiwan over the years, and the normal practice of friends visiting each other is inherent in our culture of hospitality. Military exercises are unnecessary responses. Taiwan has always been open to constructive dialogue, and we will work with stakeholders to bring about stability and peace in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And now I'm honored to give the floor to Speaker Pelosi to deliver her remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam President, for your leadership and for the leadership gathered here with you today. I'm proud of my delegation. We're almost like one unit. The chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the chairman of the Mr. Meeks, Mr. Takano, chair of Veterans Affairs, vice chair of Energy and, Ways and Means, the Trade Committee, Congresswoman Susan Del Bene, a member of the Intelligence Committee, Mr. Krishnamurthy, and a member of the Foreign Affairs and Armed Services Committee, Mr. Kim. I say that because when I speak, my receiving your kind words as well as this invitation is really received and appreciated by members of Congress. On both sides of the aisle, on both sides of the Capitol, great enthusiasm for the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. Let's just put it in perspective. Over 4 decades ago, the Taiwan Relations Act was built in building a strong bond between our two countries, advancing our shared interests of governance, economy, and security, while respecting the one China policy. Our solidarity with you is more important than ever as you defend Taiwan and your freedom. In our bilateral meeting, we discussed key opportunities to deepen our partnership, upholding democracy and human rights and respect for the individual, combating, well, I'll get around to comment. 3 areas that I just mentioned: security, economy, governance. Security, our relationship is a strong one, and we discussed how we can make it stronger and more and up to date. In economy, we talked about a trade agreement that might be possible and soon. And in governance, among other things, and in governance, I want to salute Taiwan for the leadership you have provided in fighting COVID. Probably one of the highest rates of vaccination, but also the lowest number of deaths from COVID, a real model for the world. It's about science, but it's also about community acceptance of a plan, and that is called leadership. So thank you for that, a lesson to all of us. And so as we deal with those 3 areas, we come here following the President's lead on the Indo-Pacific economic framework. That's interesting. We support that. Again, in terms of security, economy, and governance. Taiwan's not a part of that, so we want to build a different set with the economic package, with our security package, and a trade agreement, hopefully, that is imminent. So this is a very important time for us because we came here to listen and to learn about how we can do this more effectively, really achieving the goals for Taiwan that we all aspire to but don't understand as fully as we do now because of this trip. So again, it's a great pride for us today, the first woman speaker in the House, meeting the first woman president of Taiwan. We have some enthusiasm for that, and again, we're very proud of our representative, Sandra Kirk, and I'm proud of my colleague, Susan Delbene. So they took a moment to take some pride in women's leadership. Again, our delegation came here to send an unequivocal message. America stands with Taiwan. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, Your Honorable. Right now, with the permission of our President and Speaker Pelosi, we'll be taking up questions from the media. So we'll proceed right now taking the first questions from Taiwanese media, and it will be raised by Mr. Joseph Ye from CNA. Joseph?
President Tsai, Madam Speaker, I'm Joe from the Central News Agency. I'm representing more than hundreds of Taiwanese media. I was given one question, so the question will be a little bit long. So please bear with me, because we have waited for 25 years for this chance. So you're the first House Speaker to visit Taiwan in 25 years. So do you foresee that your visit will bring up even more similar high senior official U.S. to visit Taiwan in the future, or maybe future speakers? This is the first part of my question. And the second part is, in accordance with Taiwan Travel Act, high-level visit a two-way thing. So a lot of U.S. congressmen has proposed President Tsai to speak at U.S. Congress, if possible. Do you see that it could realize anytime soon in the near future, especially under your leadership in the House? And the final question is, I'm sorry, 25 years again, sorry. The final question is, how do you see how the Chinese welcome you with military exercise and sanctions against Taiwan? Do you foresee that? Thank you.
Well, first let me thank you for your questions on behalf of all of those other people, and to say that in terms of our visit here, and would that lead to other visits, I certainly hope so. But I think it's important to note that members of Congress, several of them have made trips just earlier this year. 5 senators, bipartisan, came, again, including the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, Mr. Menendez, came. Not too much of a fuss was made. Individual senators have made trips or plan to make trips. And I just hope that it's really clear that while China has stood in the way of Taiwan participating and going to certain meetings, that they understand that they will not stand in the way of people coming to Taiwan. It's a show of friendship, of support, but also a source of learning about how we can work together better in collaboration. So, I think that they made a big fuss because I'm speaker, I guess. I don't know if that was a reason or an excuse, because they didn't say anything when the men came. What the second part was,
invited to the U.S. Congress to make...
Oh, that was the third part, but I'll go there. Okay. That was the third part, I thought. We haven't had a joint session in probably 3 years in Congress, partially because of COVID, but even before that it was Christmas and all that. So we haven't had many joint sessions. But we have tried to accommodate visits by bringing together, both sides of the aisle and both sides of the Capitol. And I would hope that that opportunity would be there. The joint session has become something, again, because of COVID, we aren't able to. It's even hard for us to do the President's State of the Union address because you have the space and you have the time and, well, here we are. I don't know. I think that whatever China was going to do, they will do in their own good time. What excuse they may use to do it is another thing. But you really know more about that than I do. I do think that it's really important for the message to be clear that in the Congress, House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans are committed to the security of Taiwan in order to have Taiwan be able to most effectively defend themselves. But it also is about our shared values of democracy and freedom and how Taiwan has been an example to the world in that regard. And whether it's certain insecurities on the part of the president of China as to his own political situation that he's rattling a saber, I don't know. But it doesn't really matter. What matters to us is that we salute the successes of Taiwan. We work together for the security of Taiwan, and we just take great lessons from the democracy in Taiwan.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Right now, we take questions from the international media, and I would like to invite Samson Ellis. He is the Taipei Bureau Chief of Bloomberg News. Samson?
Oh, thank you.
Madam President, Madam Speaker, we have seen the Chinese authorities take multiple economic actions against individual Taiwanese companies and entire sectors of the economy here. Taiwan has already paid a cost for your visit and is likely to continue to do so over the coming days and weeks. What concrete, tangible benefits can you promise Taiwan to offset the cost of your trip?
Well, at the same time as this trip is taking place and in recognition of our common interest economically, we just passed the CHIPS and Science Act. This is something that opens the door for us to, again, have better economic exchanges. I know that some Taiwan businesses, significant ones, are already planning to invest in manufacturing in the United States. And the ingenuity, the entrepreneurial spirit, the brain power, whatever, the intellectual resource that exists in Taiwan, and the success of the tech industry here, for one sector, has been really a model. And again, we want to increase our relationship. So I think that I would be saying that would be a goal we share, but with the CHIPS Act, we're really facilitating reaching that goal. And it's pretty exciting. It's pretty exciting, and I think that you will see a recognition of the scientific success that Taiwan has had, being a model for how we go forward. That's why our bill is called CHIPS and Science.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Right now, last but not the least, we will have a representative from the Japanese media, Mr. Ishido Koichiro-san. He is the bureau chief of Asahi Shimbun of Japan.
Hello.
你好，总统。
Konnichiwa.
Hello, Speaker Pelosi. Konnichiwa. Thank you very much for taking my questions. My question is about the Chinese democracy. Now we are witnessing the Chinese authorities increasing various pressures, not only to Taiwanese people and Hong Kongese, but to their own citizens, I mean the Chinese people. And as a strong and long-time advocate of democracy, please let us share your ideas. How the democratic countries, including South Korea, Japan, where you are heading to, can deter China from invading Taiwan militarily, and how we can guide China toward a democratic political system. Thank you.
Well, two things. In the context, your question comes in the context of right now a struggle between autocracy and democracy in the world. We cannot back away from that. And so as China goes and uses its soft power, money and whatever, into many countries in order to get their support at the UN and other bodies, we have to recognize if that has some effectiveness, because it's a lot of money and it's promises that may or may not ever be kept. So when we talk about Taiwan in that context, we have to talk from strength. We have to talk from strength. We have to talk from what Taiwan has been so good about is being technologically advanced, whether it's in business or security. And we have to show the world, and that's one of the purposes of our trip, to show the world the success of the people of Taiwan, their courage to change their own country to become more democratic, their respect for people and the rest, and quite frankly, a model in this region in that respect, in those respects. So strength, goodwill, and again, the demonstration of a democracy that has evolved to a stronger place now, and it offers a very strong contrast to what's happening on mainland China. No more evidence needed than what happened in Hong Kong under one country, two systems. It didn't happen. But again, we're not here to talk about mainland China. We're here to talk about Taiwan. We have our our Taiwan Relations Act. We support the communiques, this, that, and the other thing that had gone before. So we're supporters of the status quo and the rest. We don't want anything to happen to Taiwan by force. So strength, And one of the biggest sources of strength is democracy. I said at a meeting earlier with the parliamentarians, in our earliest days of our founding of our country, Benjamin Franklin, our presidency, said, freedom and democracy. Freedom and democracy on one thing, security here. If we don't have, we can't have either if we don't have both. So, security, economics, security, economy, and again, they're all, and governance, they're all related, and we want Taiwan to always have freedom with security, and we're not backing away from that. Okay?
Thank you very much.
Anything you'd like to add to anything?
Okay. Thank you so very much, ladies and gentlemen. Today's
the
event
U.S.
is
House
especially
Speaker
important
Nancy
because
Pelosi
we're
with the
witnessing
Taiwanese president at a press conference. The House Speaker describing the friendship as very important. It is a solidarity that the U.S. is prioritizing now. I want to widen out the conversation, get out to Junbei Luch, the portfolio manager at Tribeca Investment Partners. Junbei, this feels like one of those moments in 2022 where we are at a geopolitical crossroads, and sure thing, we've had a couple of those to say the least. Your initial reaction and how the market is likely to price in what is a ratcheting up, a visible and tangible ratcheting up of tension.
Look, initial reaction is that I thought our equity market will be down a lot more based on, what is happening right now. Surprisingly, the Asian equity market is holding up well, and even the future market is pointing to some green days tomorrow. So, but still early days. I would say that, we should expect somewhat negative reactions, particularly across commodities and the like, just given that tension is going to put pressure in terms of trade relationship, because in the last few weeks, there has been hope that the trade tension might ease somewhat. So this certainly will go a step backwards. And secondly is that do remember political tension, it rarely does it have long-lasting effect on the equity market. So if we look back in the last few decades, the effect itself is somewhat temporary. So put these two aside, investors are likely to be cautious, but for the longer-term investors, it's really probably a good opportunity for dipping your toe and buy some of the high-quality companies.
Well, maybe it's the calm before the storm. Let's see how the Chinese really react to this. It's the most severe maneuvers since the early 90s. Junbei, obviously, the bond markets were where the material risk profile altered yesterday. The sixth biggest one-day move in bond markets in the 10-year tenor ever. So that explosion in bond yields has really been rocked by the Fed speak. They're far from done. And Bullard now talking about a rate of 3.75 to 4%. How quickly do you think we could get to 4%, Junbei? And do you think the bond market is materially priced for that?
Look, I think the bond market, I like your word explosion, certainly is a significant jump in terms of the yield. I think it's very unlikely for us to really get to that 4%. In terms of the inflation reading coming through in the next few months, it should show easing of inflation. We have seen the peaking in the last couple of months, just given the commodity price movements and given what's been happening around the world in terms of supply chain. So all of that should point to slightly softer inflationary pressure. While we continue to see the near-term interest rate going up as much as expected, but for the longer term, it's probably unlikely to get to what it is suggested by the bond market. So it is a short-term reaction to what Fed has said, but take a slightly longer-term view. We just don't think that inflation is going to hold on in that high single digit for long.
So part of the big bond move came from the commentary from some of the Fed officials who are trying to kind of push away on the idea that we're going to get any moderation in the Fed's path towards trying to bring inflation down, that there is not going to be a slowing down of rate hikes. The equity market, though, I mean, regardless of what you're throwing at it today or in the last 24 hours or the last 72 hours, it just keeps, it's like Teflon. Everything just doesn't stick. I mean, how do you explain that?
Oh, look, absolutely. Equity market has gone through a tremendous amount of volatility in the last 3 months or so. There is a lot of expectations being priced into what is to come. And remember, usually when we pending economic weakness and, when we're entering those periods, we will see earnings downgrading. We'll see corporate earnings get downgraded in a meaningful way and as a group. However, this time around, a lot of corporates are yet to downgrade earnings. So equity market share price actually have fallen ahead of actual earnings fall. So that's in that sort of environment, I would say some of those, move in terms of expectation of high interest rate, high inflation is being pricing into the share prices. So far, the US reporting season, things are not too bad. The real economy is still holding up okay in the US over there. Some of the tech companies report, consumer tech companies reported earnings above expectations while, by small amounts. So things are not too bad yet. Yes, they will get slower. They're kind of okay. That's why share market is holding on to its gains at this point, just because, valuations come back, earnings still there. We still got dividend. We still got buyback. While there's uncertainty, the downside seems somewhat cushioned.
I think maybe we're both reading different reports. If you look at the ISM and you look at the inventories, the highest since the 1990s, June Bay, and the savings rate at the lowest since 2009, you'll take the bid. I'll give you the offer. Where are we in terms of, did you buy tech and consumer discretionary, the darlings of July? Did you jump into tech and take that rip higher?
Look, you know what? We started earlier. We started it early this calendar year. But rather than just tech, we bought healthcare. To us, healthcare was the growth leaders that's been sold off. It provides lots of defensive earnings and yet growth trajectory for the entire portfolio. We bought some large tech names and put into portfolio. Consumer discretionary for us, that's too early. That is a little bit tough, and particularly earning hasn't really fallen, and I think that's got a long way to go. So yeah, absolutely, we got we're quality proof for the portfolio.
Okay, quality proof that portfolio. Junbei Liu, thank you very much for being with us. Breaking news on SocGen. The numbers hit the tape. Net loss. Let's just have a look at these, Yusuf, because the second quarter saw a net loss of 1.4 billion. The estimate for that loss was 2.26, so a materially better number. Now, in part, this is going to be driven by the loan loss provision, which has come down, as well as, let's see what they're saying about Russia. So the loan loss provision is coming down to 217 million. The estimate out there was for 615, but it looks as if it's the rising rate environment and the investment bank which is helping the profit beat. And just looking down at the top level, Yusuf, in terms of global markets, 1.7 billion, and the market had penciled in 1.48.
Yeah, going into this, I mean, investors were mainly focused on the impact of the bank's Russia exit, whether or not the consensus fully prices it. There's scope for potential surprises is what the folks at Citi were saying. The revenue line is at 7.07 billion. The market was looking for 6.43 billion. So just like you were saying about the narrow loss, on the revenue side, it's a stronger beat. They're targeting an ROTE, so that's a return on tangible equity, of course, in 2025 of about 10%, 17 buys, 11 holds, and 0 sells on the stock. Quite a bullish setup as we count down to the opening later in Europe.
And the investment bank, the finance and advisory business, reported a 14% higher revenue. That's something different to what we saw from some of the others on the street in terms of UBS and Credit Suisse, etc., on the advisory side of the business. So in terms of breaking down, the global markets is a significant beat, 1.7 billion. FIC trading, a good beat, 683. The market penciled in 535. And equities, 833. So a monster beat all the way around in the investment bank. And we'll catch up with the head of investment banking, Savamir Krupa. He'll join me at 9:30 Dubai time. Let's see whether the bonuses will still be massive, as he told me the last time. Let's get to Jules. She's standing by in Singapore with all the very latest. Jules.
Hey, Manus. Yeah, well, we're still reacting to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. And one thing that is not showing up on my GMM, but which we will be watching in about half an hour's time when China and Hong Kong markets resume, is the rally that you're actually seeing in Chinese chip makers. So we've seen the likes of SMIC up by as much as 9% in Hong Kong as we continue to see the ongoing tension between the US and China over Taiwan very much play out into some of these semiconductor stocks. We know Nancy Pelosi expected to meet with Taiwan's TSMC. The TAIEX itself is down for a third session, off by about 0.2%, and still seeing some weakness in the Taiwan dollar with that 30 level against the greenback. But elsewhere, it's kind of sanguine when you look at market action. I mentioned some of the rallying that you're seeing in the chip makers. You've also seen Hong Kong in general look quite good, and Japan's Nikkei 225 is also higher. So a lot calmer than what we saw this time yesterday before Nancy Pelosi had arrived in Taiwan and when it was still a speculated planned trip. But you mentioned earlier the dislocation you're seeing in bond markets after we had the Fed very much indicated they are not done with fighting inflation, and that's being flown out through into the bond markets here in Asia too. So yields spiking. Have a look at Australia's 2-year yield up by almost 13 basis points, also coming on the back of yesterday's RBA hike. Yusuf.
Yeah, there's a bit of speculation as to whether we're going to see Chinese authorities offload some of their holdings in U.S. Treasuries as one of the responses to what they see as an interference in their part of the world. In the meantime, the soaring tensions between the U.S. and China could raise prospects for Korean shares. What's the story there?
Yeah, this is a call coming through from Societe Generale saying that these Taiwan troubles could be an opportunity for Korean stocks. Essentially what they're suggesting here is to take a short against Taiwanese stocks while buying South Korean stocks as a hedge, so those South Korean chip makers instead. They're saying they see evidence of higher risk perception from geopolitical concerns on Taiwanese equities, which have already been pummeled so far this year because of the conflict in Ukraine too, and concerns about what that meant with Russia's move into Ukraine and what it could potentially mean in terms of Beijing move on Taiwan as well. As you can see on my GTV chart here, Taiwan's stock index lost about 25% this year in dollar terms. That is more than any market in the region, and underperforming the South Korean Kospi, which SocGen is suggesting could be a better trade on this play. Manus.
Jules, thank you very much. Julia Tully there in Singapore. To the oil markets, OPEC Plus watchers are waiting to see if the group will heed or snub President Biden's call to boost crude supplies. The US leader is expecting further steps from the cartel to cool prices at the pump. Joining us now is Vandana Hari, CEO and founder of Vandana Insights. Good to have you with us. So Biden left Saudi Arabia with high expectations. You know what? We'll get back to Vanda in. Guest is with us. Technical problems. Vandana, good to have you with us. A very good morning to you. We're just setting the stage there for the OPEC Plus meeting. The Americans left Saudi Arabia with much expectation. I think Bob McNally says his advisors left Riyadh high in confidence of further OPEC Plus steps, and if OPEC Plus doesn't deliver, well, they're going to have a lot of explaining today to do. Do you really think, are you expecting any incremental or a material shift higher from OPEC Plus at the end of today's business? Good morning.
No, the short answer to that is no, Manus. You know, it's understandable why the expectations and hopes are high in the U.S. following President Biden's visit to the kingdom last month. You know, clearly the narrative coming out of the White House in Washington, D.C. is that Saudi Arabia will heed the U.S.'s call, President Biden's call. But, you know, I think OPEC Plus has a completely different calculus to keep in mind. Clearly, yes, they will want to bear in mind what the U.S. wants, but it's only part of the whole landscape. Look, OPEC Plus needs to decide, does it actually, according to its own calculations, does the world need more of its oil? The answer to that is no. You know, we had the JTC, the technical committee meeting of OPEC Plus yesterday, estimating 800,000 barrels per day average surplus of oil this year. So according to OPEC's own calculations, no. The second question is what, you know, how would it affect an increase? Mm-hmm. You know, most of the members are still struggling to revive output even to their current quota levels.
Yeah. I mean, that's what's bothering me, Vandana. I mean, it's causing quite a bit of cognitive dissonance. I'm going to use this opportunity to get this off my chest. Theory versus practice. In May, they were under-delivering by 2.7 million barrels a day. So that is the planned cut from original baselines versus the actual cut. There's a credibility problem here. How do they close the gap and lead from the front again?
Yusuf, I'm not so sure OPEC Plus internally regards this as a credibility problem because, they haven't really addressed it openly. The shortfall that you talk about, anywhere between 2.7 to 2.8 million barrels per day below the combined target of OPEC, non-OPEC. And I suspect that gap is probably going to persist. So as I mentioned, it's, of course, members are struggling. Most of the members are struggling to revive output. And now we also have, since about March, we have Russian supplies being crimped by Western sanctions as well. So, I don't think that's a major issue. And again, we have to balance that with what OPEC sees as the call on its oil. It is predicting quite a bump in global oil demand in Q4, but it is expecting, if you look at their last monthly report, it is expecting nearly 1.7 million barrel per day drop in global oil demand through the first half of next year. So, the question, and we're not even into Q4 yet, right? They're making the decision for September. So,
nor do we have China open yet, and this is probably what Saudi Arabia are waiting to see. And this brings us to the piece that Javier Blas put out along with a number of other Bloomberg columnists. It's about Saudi Arabia's production. We're showing the last line of defense for the oil market. It's only 3 times in history has Saudi Arabia managed to keep pumping beyond 11 million barrels. From what you can see and understand from Aramco and Saudi Arabia, do you think that they will be able to endure at this kind of production level? And is that the saving grace on the production side?
I think those doubts that have been raised in recent months about Saudi Arabia's actual production capacity is the matter is a bit nuanced. We need to understand that as well. So can they increase output to 11, 12, beyond 11? The answer to that is yes. But, what the world really needs to know and would want in the case of a real shortage and emergency is can they sustain levels at, above 11 or at whatever they say the full capacity is. And, there are doubts around that. And I would think for good reason.
Mohammed Barkindo, the former Secretary General of OPEC, he passed away on July 5. Everybody's got a story about meeting or hanging out with Dr. Barkindo. I mean, he leaves a legacy, but at the same time, that also raises the bar for this meeting with OPEC Plus, that the new Secretary General needs to kind of rally the troops. Does he have the weight, the influence, the reach to build on what Mohammed Barkindo left behind?
So I agree with you, Yusuf. I think Mr. Haitham Al-Qais will have big shoes to fill. Mr. Barkindo led the group through some very, very challenging times. And, I think enough has been said already about the panache with which he did it and the ease with which he did it. But, overall, I think I don't see really any risks to OPEC plus unity, cohesion, or them being able to get everybody on board for whatever they decide. It's kind of been the path has been set. Saudi Arabia is the de facto leader. It has made sure time and again that Russia is by its side. And, again, lately we had the same being reiterated from both sides. So as long as, Saudi Arabia and Russia are on board, they even maybe in private agree the course that is to be set, I really don't see much problem in OPEC Plus managing to keep the unity and proceed with its agreements.
Vandana, thanks for weighing in on a lot of these topics. Noah, you've got to run, so that's Vandana Hari. We'll let you go, to CEO and founder of Vandana Insights. We've got much more coming up then on the program. We'll get straight to the U.S. State Department because they're saying they are approving potential military sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE worth a combined $5.3 billion. This could include Patriot missiles, and it comes weeks after a meeting between President Joe Biden and the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Simone Foxman has more from Doha. So Simone, where does that kind of leave the broader picture between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, given that we're counting down on this OPEC Plus meeting today?
Well, Yusuf, it's very tempting to kind of draw that connection between the meeting between President Biden and Mohammed bin Salman last month, this desire for oil from the U.S. side, and even the OPEC Plus meeting and decision forthcoming today. And certainly if we don't get OPEC Plus increasing production numbers today, critics are going to tie these missile sales to a perceived lack of success by the U.S. government. But when we look at these missile sales in the historical context and what's been happening the last couple of years, this is really a continuation of the policy that the U.S. has had, which has been to resupply Saudi Arabia with weapons meant for defensive purposes, protecting it from attacks by Houthi rebels backed by Yemen on its southern border and the like. And to that end, there actually was a pretty significant development, the extension of a ceasefire for yet another 2 months in Yemen between its warring groups yesterday. The UN welcomed that, the U.S. largely responsible for that. And while we've seen limited progress on truly finding sort of a comprehensive long-term agreement to end this lengthy war in Yemen, a ceasefire there is something that the U.S. is going to applaud because of how important that is for the humanitarian situation of its 30 million residents, most of which live below the poverty line, and many of which are suffering from hunger continually, even after so many years.
Well, certainly the G7 price cap is also going to be called into play with the China, Taiwan, US tripartite of angst. To Kuwait, you've got the Emir there dissolving parliament. We're waiting for the next round of elections. How would you describe the state of politics?
Yeah, this dissolution of parliament, the establishment of a new government earlier in the week, and then late last month, the appointment of a new prime minister, all of these things really on our way, getting us on our way to this next round of elections in Kuwait, likely to happen within the next 2 months. But I would point you to some of what was said by the crown prince who dissolved parliament and when he did it. He said this is to rectify the political scene and to rectify behavior that undermines national unity. There have been all these sorts of threats thrown out about how significant the political deadlock is in terms of standing in the way of Kuwait's progress, of its economic health. Remember, Kuwait, the government can't issue more government debt at this point. We're looking at the outstanding bonds it has at lows for several years against overall benchmarks. So there is a sort of sense here that there is a serious economic problem being caused by this political deadlock. But, you know, I think it's going to take us several more months to see whether or not the parliament that we actually get after those next round of elections can do anything to kind of spin us forward and take us past this moment of this political dysfunction.
It's getting very tiring, these elections in Kuwait and the dissolution of parliament. It's almost like quarterly earnings now, every 3 months. Let's get to economics. We'll get the latest read on inflation data in Turkey. What's expected there?
We expect inflation to yet again go higher, over 80% a year-on-year basis in July this time. Every analyst believes that we'll see that number top out over 80%, but exactly how much is kind of the question here. And the concern, as Ram Capital pointed out, is that inflation essentially gets to a point where it's out of control amid the monetary policy that we're seeing. And this is of particular interest when we look at the markets right now to the corporate sector. We've seen a lot of complaints from various industrialists and companies recently, far more than we typically get, about the costs of doing business. For one, there's distress in some of the largest corporate bonds. For example, the second largest telecom provider in Turkey is seeing its bonds move into distressed territory this week. $16 billion worth of corporate debt is due by May 2024. And then we're also watching companies complain about the rates at which they're seeing in order to borrow, making business much more difficult for them. That's kind of the area we're paying most attention to, even though we're watching these sort of stunning numbers in the Turkish lira, flirting with 18 to the US dollar. And that's something we continue to see within all economists really expecting inflation to continue to move higher.
Okay, Simone, thank you very much. Great roundup. Simone Foxman there at the Qatar Financial Centre in Doha with the very latest across the region from Kuwait and beyond. This is Bloomberg.
The second half of the year has begun, and it is a totally new story. The risks are a fresh new cycle of further volatility, greater inequality, and further inflation challenges, with markets worrying that the Fed's delayed aggressive tightening will be forced to stop due to a higher recession threat. This could prompt 1970s, 1980s style stagflation, which could continue contributing to worse and longer stocks and government bonds bear market.
You will put a woman on Mars. You will bring forth global cooling. You will be the first chief crypto officer. Because when you subscribe to Bloomberg, you won't just get news. You'll get insight into limitless possibilities, knowledge, and inspiration to feed your ambition. So before you invent, pioneer, disrupt, before you change the world, Bloomberg.
Strong enough to stay, we will never. However you get your news.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak with Lee.
On Bloomberg Radio.
Welcome to Daybreak Australia. This is Bloomberg Technology. This is Bloomberg Green.
On TV, radio, and the web, this is Bloomberg.
Let's get to one of the key companies on the Dubai Index. This is T-Com. They are freshly listed just a couple of months ago. So this is their first quarterly earnings announcement, and they're coming through here with an increase of 54% year on year. That is for the second quarter profit at 237.3 million dirhams. It listed at 270 a share. We are at 237 as of close in the previous session. Let's widen out the conversation around regional equity markets and get to our expert, Farah Al-Bahrawi. So far, our earnings continued to be the key driver. What stood out to you?
Etisala actually stood out for me, Yusuf. I mean, I'll briefly touch upon T-Com that you mentioned and then get to Etisala. It's going to be a really important stock to watch at the open. 54% jump after its lackluster debut would be something maybe that investors are looking at. But let's just get back into Etisala very quickly. It beat net income estimates, but at the same time, the stock fell just over 1.4% yesterday. Looking at what Bloomberg Intelligence said about this company is that they expect organic growth of the low single digits for 2022, and they expect more M&A from the company, but they're hoping for it to be more of regional acquisitions rather than the stake we saw Etisalat take in Vodafone, for example. So that's something to watch out for. Any other local names or regional names that Etisalat could be going after?
Yeah, and their revenue's up 54%. Is what they're saying on the top line there, just opening up the statement. We'll go through that a little bit more detail later on. You've also got Bank Al Jazeera tumbling after their results. I mean, this is it. If you don't deliver, you get a flesh wound, isn't it? But you are well rewarded if you can over-deliver. So what went on with Al Jazeera?
Absolutely. I mean, you know the bank story in Saudi Arabia, man, is they're overvalued and investors are increasingly becoming more selective. So it's very easy to get penalized if banks don't deliver. And Bank Al Jazeera certainly didn't when it came to comparisons to analyst estimates. Net income fell short and SMB Capital attributed that to a decline in the net special income commissions. So again, Bank Al Jazeera is competing in a very big market in Saudi Arabia. We have players like Al-Rashhi and SNB. So the banks in Saudi Arabia are going to continue to be super important to keep an eye out for.
I mean, there's a little bit of a summer lull in transaction activity across the Gulf. What are some of the other factors you're watching?
Right. I mean, I guess the most important thing, not just me, but pretty much everyone watching Gulf equities will be keeping an eye out for is OPEC and what they're going to be deciding on. I mean, any surprise could really be a key factor to move our markets either way here in the region. We were just discussing the rally that we had over the past couple of days, and investors continue to expect this to be a super volatile period in the Gulf. So if we do get a surprise negatively specifically, we might see an impact, particularly in Saudi Arabia, where it tends to move more with oil prices. And Teva, that's another company to watch out for after it said that it's having supply disruptions with Adderall. Of course, it's the key drug for the company, so when Israel opens, keep an eye out for Teva.
Okay, Farah, thank you very much. I see how TCOM does on the open. Farah Al-Barahi there with the very latest on the equity markets, what you can expect for the day ahead. We'll keep you up to date right here on Daybreak Middle East. This is Bloomberg.
VK ฟิล์มที่ช่างติดรถยนต์แนะนำติดง่ายกันร้อนดีราคาถูก
We've had the SocGen earnings just over 30 minutes ago. Monster investment bank, FIC, equities, all doing a lot better. Loan losses significantly lower, and they are giving us a new line on guidance now in terms of what we can expect from the markets business going forward. So this is a pretty good set of numbers. They're going to go for an annual revenue growth as well, Yusuf, of over 3% at SocGen.
Yeah, this bank's been through a lot, and now you've got this global trading rally providing a tailwind to the outgoing CEO, Frederick Rodet. I'm just looking through the statement. He says that the quarter concluded 2 years of intense, disciplined execution on various strategic projects. They're confident about the short term and undeniably more uncertain environment in the medium term. We were talking earlier about how bullish some of the analysts are. 17 buys, 11 holds, 0 sells, although shares have underperformed the benchmark CAC 40 index in France, down 13.2%.
So the new line on the markets business is that they see 4.7 to 5.3 billion in global markets revenue in 2025. So this is resetting the narrative for the FIC, the equities and the advisory business, which all, as I said, did very, very well. You're looking at the FIC business, 683 million, well above the estimates of 535, and equities about 100 million above the estimates. So, of course, we'll put all those questions to Slavomir Krupa. He's the head of the investment bank. He's in the running to take over from Uday as well.
Yeah, and then also a quick look here at the equity futures. Remarkable resilience in light of the visit of the U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan and the raising of some of the tensions in the U.S. and China. We just called a little bit higher here. This is Bloomberg.
VK ฟิล์มรถยนต์กันร้อนดีราคาถูกรถยนต์เริ่มต้น 3,000 บาท
one of the most fascinating entrepreneurs because you also started really young. What did you learn? Did you always think that you'd be an entrepreneur?
Probably, yes. I think, which is a bit sad,
From
isn't it?
age, what, 5,
well,
6?
Maybe, I'm not sure. I come from a family of entrepreneurs, so even though I probably can spell the word and still can't occasionally, it's sort of in my blood. But it's really fun starting a business. And fun growing a business. I feel it's a real privilege. And I started my business officially at 18, but I think I knew I wanted to do it very differently from about 15. But I'm sure it's, if you're surrounded by it, it feels very natural. So yes, it's fun.
And it started how? You started by you went to Florence. It was in Italy, and you started handbags.
Yeah, so I knew I was actually given a handbag by my mother when I was about 16, one of her old handbags, and I remember how it made me feel, and I think fashion is fascinating for the mood-changing, the confidence-boosting aspects, so the sort of tribal aspects of what fashion does. And so I went at 18 to Florence, knowing that was the home of leather goods, which is what interested me. I just wanted to learn, actually, and be surrounded by craftsmen who, making things is important, and that's going to be very interesting, I think, over the next sort of 10 years. I think the onshoring of craft and manufacturing is going to be fascinating, actually. I watched the offshoring. I literally saw it, and I think we're going to be seeing that coming back to local. We have to. When we're all looking at our objectives in terms of carbon, proximity is going to be key.
Everything you need to get set for the start of U.S. trading. Bloomberg The Open with Jonathan Farrell. Drilling down on the numbers and preparing you as only Bloomberg can. Weekdays on Bloomberg.
Good morning from our Middle East headquarters in Dubai. I'm Menace Cranny. This is Daybreak Europe with the stories that set your agenda. Standing with Taiwan. House Speaker Pelosi meets President Tsai and praises one of the world's freest societies. But an enraged China announces provocative military drills and halts some trade by way of retaliation. No pivot. Treasury yields surge after Fed officials pour cold water on a quick turn away from the current tightening cycle. Plus, OPEC watch, the oil alliance is expected to maintain production levels today, potentially snubbing the White House calls for Saudi Arabia to boost supplies. It is a feast of breaking news for you here on Bloomberg this morning. A quick recap for you on SocGen. We are looking at a monster beat. The loss nearly 40% below the estimate, 1.48 billion. The market penciled in 2.26. You're looking at loan losses coming down to 217 million. Approximately a third of what the market had estimated. The equities business is charging ahead, 833 million euros, and fixed income commodity business also trouncing the estimates. We'll ask the man who's in running for the CEO job, Slavomir Krupa, in just under 30 minutes, how he's going to grow the markets business to 4.7 to 5.3 billion in the next 3 years. He joins me in just over 30 minutes. Stay tuned for the man whose hat is in the ring for leadership at Societe Generale. Okay, Commerzbank. Where shall we go to next? Let's kick in to Commerzbank. Net income 470 million, that's a beat. The market had penciled in 397 million. Loan loss provision, a little bit lighter than expected. So this is a theme that's building, but can it endure in a recessionary environment, which is said to be coming down the pike? They confirm the outlook for the year. The net interest income also swelling to 1.48 billion. So above the estimate again. Still seeing the full year net income of €1 billion. The estimate was 1.06. Let's keep an eye on that. Can they endure with that guidance, with a recession and loan losses at a steady state? So that is Commerzbank with a equity buffer, a core equity tier 1 buffer, 13.7%, and the market has it in 13.5. Let me take you briefly to AXA. We will just get into the AXA numbers. A buyback Buyback for all my friends, not just the oil companies, but insurance as well. AXA launching a buyback of €1 billion. Revenue certainly beating the estimates, 55.14. The market has it at 54.23. And on a net basis, also a considerable beat, 4.1. So no sign of a slowdown or exceptional items so far in this report on the wildfires and the sort of the various natural disasters that we've had. Those are the reports. Let's get to our reporters around the world. Nancy Pelosi's contentious visit to Taiwan. We have the team, Cindy Wang in Taipei, Colin Murphy in Beijing. So let's get to Taipei first of all. I listened to Speaker Nancy Pelosi saying she didn't understand why such a fuss was being made. Maybe it's because she's a woman and all the other visitors were men. So how did it go down? How did the speech go down? Do you think she took some heat out of the political angst?
We want Taiwan to always have freedom with security, and we're not backing away from that.
Let's get to Cindy. She's in Taipei right now with us. Pelosi spoke twice. She made it very, very clear about the US standing with Taiwan on a number of different directives. Do you think she escalated this situation or de-escalated the situation? So, Cindy.
Yes, Pelosi meet with.
Very good. So what is your take? What is your take? Pelosi talked about security, economy, and governance, and she made it very, very clear, an unequivocal message that the US stands by Taiwan. Your take?
Yes, that's right. Pelosi told Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen this morning during their meeting at the presidential office that U.S. won't abandon Taiwan. And right now, it's more than ever, the U.S. solidarity with Taiwan is crucial, and that's the message she wants to bring to the Taiwanese people. So Pelosi's visit receives huge welcome by the Taiwanese president as well as lawmakers at the legislature. So Pelosi says that it seems that one country, two system didn't happen in Hong Kong, and she wants that Taiwan to be secure and freedom as well. So that's really a strong and powerful message that she is bringing to Taiwan right now. She is also saying that she discussed the possibility, the trade possibilities with the Taiwanese leaders, as well as other possibilities for deepening cooperation from both sides. So that's really a huge boost for Taiwanese people's confidence and also the Taiwanese government led by President Tsai Ing-wen, because since President Tsai took office in 2016, she has boosted support. She has tried her best to seek foreign support and also seek U.S. support. So Pelosi's visit undoubtedly is going to be another successful win for the DPP government here in Taiwan.
Okay, Cindy, thank you very much. Let's get across to Colin. He's standing by for us. I mean, Pelosi's visit has prompted China to announce missile tests, military drills, some of the most provocative actions since the 1990s. Taiwan's president says the island would not back down on heightened military threats.
Military exercises are unnecessary responses. Taiwan has always been open to constructive dialogue, and we will work with stakeholders to bring about stability and peace in the region.
Well, Colin was there just a second ago. Let's return to him. Colin, here we are. These military drills, the most significant since 1994, 6 exclusion zones. I mean, when you read the list of what China is doing with some new tariffs and some new action on that, how significant are these drills?
Well, I think most people are saying that it is definitely an escalation compared to the previous incidences in the 1990s. But even as you go through the list of the different measures, it's still not enough to satisfy some of the people here in China. And there were some social media chatter overnight expressing disappointment at the level of retaliation, especially when you contrast that with the, bellicose and hyperbole that was in place before the visit took place, where there was a lot of menacing language coming from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. So even though the list is quite long of the measures that China is taking, some people say that it's not going far enough, and this is crucial because if there is a gap, and this gap persists between the actions that the government is taking and the perception amongst the broader expanse of the general public, then of course that's going to reflect poorly on the government perhaps, and also of course on Xi Jinping, this year being a critical year for him. The last thing he wants to be seen is to be considered weak by his own people.
Yes, and indeed, Pelosi did make it's fascinating. If you go back and listen to the speech from Pelosi, she talked about Xi's own insecurities in regards to what's going on in China. You're on your way to the finance minister's briefing. What do you think that is going to yield, Colin? Is it going to be more about action on Taiwan? 88%, I love Stephen Szczeciński's op-ed, 88% of all the major huge cargo ships traveled through Taiwan Straits last year. This is a big left-tail risk for the world supply chains.
Clearly, and yes, as you mentioned, we'll be actually going to a briefing. It's actually by the Chinese Foreign Ministry. That takes place at 3 o'clock today. And, it's impossible to guess exactly the nature of the press briefing today. One of the possibilities would be sanctions, and actually sanctions on Pelosi herself. This is something that has been done in the past. There's a number of US officials have been sanctioned. But the general feeling is that sanctioning US officials is not that effective, and a more sort of pressing or impactful approach would be to pursue US companies, or as you mentioned, some of the logistics issues around shipping or chips. But we haven't really seen a lot of evidence that that's the next step. But it would be definitely an escalation, and would be definitely more impactful than, say, sanctions on US officials that are in effect meaningless.
Colin, thank you very much. Let's see how things evolve and whether the Chinese are just keeping their powder dry in regards to global angst that can be brought to bear. Colin Murphy in Beijing. Let me just set up the risk agenda for you. I would say the bond markets exploded, and that's really where you want to focus. But the equity markets is where you are seeing some level of stoicism, one could say. S&P futures are managing to eke out gains. They're up 1/8 of 1%. Bank of America say it's too soon for stocks to fade recession. Don't forget the July darlings, that's tech and consumer, were the worst so far of 2022. Kalanovic, of course, expects a bullish outcome over at JP Morgan, a meaningfully higher equity market. So even as real yields turn positive, you're just looking at these equity markets holding on to some small gains. Canada endure, Asia is lower. Roll it over, have a look at the bond market. I'm so excited. It's the 6th biggest one-day move in 10-year government bonds in the history of 10-year bonds. Bullard reckons 4% on yields, 2.70% is where you are on 10-year government bonds. The Fed are far from done, and Mary Daly makes it really, really clear. We are still resolute and completely united. United we stand, and that leaves the bond markets with a lot of angst in it. Let's talk about these market moves. We've got Fed talk. Enda Karen is going to wrap that up for me. We've got Juliet Sally on the Asian angst, although some of the data coming through. Jules, we'll talk about that in a moment. The services side, a little bit of green there. And the Fed officials, they sent a powerful message. The top priority is bringing down inflation, but there is a long way to go.
We don't talk about recession per se. It's, are we growing below or above trend? And, my forecast for this year is that we'll be growing below trend, but that's necessary in order to get price increases, inflation under control.
I'd like to see the policy rate get to 3.75 to 4% this year. I think that inflation has come in hotter than what I would have expected during the second quarter. So now that has happened, I think we're going to have to go a little bit higher than what I was saying before.
Let's get to end. A high real is 4%. And do you think the market's ready for that? Good morning.
Well, certainly there seemed to be an effort to correct the market narratives, Manus. We had 4 officials from the Fed out overnight making this point that, look, bringing down inflation remains their top priority. We had Charles Evans from the Chicago Fed saying he thinks they're still a couple of reports away from getting to the point where they might be comfortable with inflation. We heard Mary Daly from the San Francisco Fed making it clear that inflation is their absolute focus for now. So it does seem to suggest that at the very least these kind of large size or jumbo sized rate hikes will still be a consideration going forward. Jim Bullard also, by the way, making the point that he sees the prospect for a soft landing still a possibility. He doesn't see a recession for the US economy. So there had been a view coming out of the last Fed meeting when Jerome Powell said that perhaps there could be some kind of a tweaking of the pace of rate hikes from here. Some interpreted that as meaning maybe they slow down the pace of those rate hikes. But I think these 4 officials overnight are making it clear that inflation remains the clear and present danger for them.
It certainly does. Let's end. Thank you very much, our Chief Asia Economics Correspondent, and Karen patiently waiting there. Let's get to Jules, because, of course, stocks in Asia, they're really trying to understand what's the outcome of Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, Jules, aren't they? But then you add in a soupçon of the Caixin. The PMIs there coming in better on the services side. Balance the act for me. How are you?
Yeah, well, a lot more sanguine today, Manus. A lot of that anxiety we had yesterday taken out of the markets, and you mentioned that pick up in services on the Caixin, which is lifting the offshore yuan. But when it comes to Taiwan, we are down for a third session. Traders citing potential benefits to the Chinese chip makers, so that is lifting the Hang Seng Tech Index. Of course, we're looking ahead to Alibaba as well. And we're watching this Bloomberg scoop too that CATL, the big EV battery maker, could actually be delaying its North American plans on Nancy Pelosi's visit. Bloomberg Intelligence saying this probably wouldn't affect the stock, but we are seeing shares down by about 2.6% today. Let's just quickly have a look at my chart as well, because SocGen coming through with a pretty interesting call that the uncertainty over Taiwan could actually boost some of the South Korean chip makers. They're saying potentially you short these Taiwan stocks and hedge on South Korean chip makers instead. Taiwan stocks have been an underperformer already ahead of Nancy Pelosi's visit this year, down some 25% in dollar terms. Manus.
Jules, thank you very much. Juliet started there with the very latest on the reaction to Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Coming up, more on the oil story. Market watchers skeptical that the OPEC Plus grouping will answer the US call for more supplies. We drill into the story right here on Bloomberg.
VK ฟิล์มที่ช่างติดรถยนต์แนะนำติดง่ายกันร้อนดีราคาถูก
เซรั่มช่วยลดเลือนจุดด่างดำ 57% ใน 4 สัปดาห์จริงหรือโดยไม่เปิดเผยยี่ห้อเซรั่มและทดสอบกับผู้หญิง 79 คน Glycolic Bright Instant Glowing Serum จาก L'Oreal Paris ผลลัพธ์ที่แสดงโดยผู้เชี่ยวชาญด้านผิวหนัง
ผลลัพธ์เหลือเชื่อมากไม่คิดว่าจุดด่างดำบนใบหน้าจะจางลงได้
จุดด่างดำใต้ตาเนี่ยจางลงอย่างเห็นได้ชัดประทับใจมากค่ะ
ทดสอบทางคลินิกแล้วช่วยลดเลือนจุดด่างดำได้ถึง 57%
โดยผู้เชี่ยวชาญด้านผิวหนังเลือกใช้
L'Oreal Paris Glycolic Bright Serum
บอกต่อทุกคนแน่นอนค่ะ
Companies now, they're getting hundreds, maybe even thousands of applications. So software has come in to automate the process.
You want to write your resume for robots, not for humans. The only job your resume has is to be comprehensible to the software that is reading it, because that software or robot is going to decide whether or not a human ever gets their eyes on it.
These things are programmed by a certain segment of the population that might not be totally inclusive or not be fully aware.
Concerns about how this technology could exacerbate discrimination. For the FTC, I think foremost, the FTC needs to be making sure that we're fully understanding this technology.
We don't trust companies to self-regulate when it comes to pollution. We don't trust them to self-regulate when it comes to workplace comp. Why on earth would we trust them to self-regulate AI?
The energy markets are tight and will remain tight and volatile.
The thing that's exercising every airline's chief executive at the moment is oil price.
Brent oil will be above $100 per barrel.
I'm calling triple digits through the end of the calendar year and into 2023.
That's the single biggest cost in terms of fuel. And at the moment, there's probably risk in that going forward.
Where we are today, there is more upside than downside.
Seeing Brent in the mid-80s and WTI in the low 80s for year end.
The temporary pullback in crude and gas prices or crude oil prices is a temporary reprieve.
Gasoline prices have come off. The continued strength of the dollar, even though, as you noted, it's weakening, and just this sheer high price is deterring people from using the cars.
OPEC is producing under capacity. We're about to see demand continue to go up.
What we do see is continued volatility and very tight markets going forward.
Our TV guests on Bloomberg weighing in on the oil market outlook. So let's stay with that story. You've got the oil watchers. A bit of skepticism creeping in that OPEC Plus will answer the call from the US President Joe Biden for more oil supplies when it meets today, expecting the coalition to preserve the remaining capacity for another day. Our reporter Stephen Stepczynski is with me. Stephen, many scenarios are being put forward on the table today for OPEC Plus decisions. You know, the question is this: is now the right time in the jaws of recession to add more? They've added back 10 million, which is what they took off. Is now the moment to turn on the spigot?
Well, according to the analysts that we surveyed, no. Right now is not the moment to do that. I mean, when you look at what Saudi Arabia has been saying for months, they don't see really a crude oil supply crunch. They see a refinery crunch, which is why you saw gasoline prices rise so much. Now those gasoline prices are falling. Oil prices have weakened down to basically pre-war levels, and the market is looking to be in a better situation than it was even just last month. So when Saudi Arabia and the other members come together, the analysts that we surveyed don't think that there will be any increase for September. That could also be due to not perhaps getting any anger out of Russia, which is having sanctions slapped against them, and they can't, they would potentially lose market share if Saudi Arabia or UAE or other countries were to boost that output. Now, that being said, there are some scenarios presented by some analysts that say, okay, there could be a modest increase to answer what Biden was asking, maybe 200,000 barrels a day. We had a very ambitious analyst who said 1 million barrels a day. Now, that seems unlikely, but if it does happen, that could add another bearish element to oil markets, and you could see this continue kind of trending down.
My apologies to our viewers whose eardrums probably popped on that. That was my inner sneeze coming out. Stephen, I loved your piece on Bloomberg.com, so much so that I've used the map, I've extolled your virtues, it's very prescient. You are identifying the tail risk, an 88% tail risk for the global economy. Qualify what 88% is. It's on US-China tensions, of course, in the Taiwan Straits. Talk me through it.
So what we're seeing now is China is going to have these war games, these missile drills in the Taiwan Strait over through this weekend, and there is this fear that it will disrupt deliveries. And it was a surprise to me when we were crunching the numbers, but 88% of large ships go through the Taiwan Strait. It is a very important part of the ocean. It's a place that it's centrally located near China, and because of that, there is this risk to supply chains, to LNG shipments, to oil shipments, and supply chains are already strained.
I think this is the most underpriced tail risk. Your article defines for me what the longer-term tail risk is for the world, Stephen. Keep up the good work. We love the Bloomberg.com articles. I'll be your banner fan for the maps. Maps go. Stephen Stepczynski there with the very latest on the oil markets and the risk from the US-China, escalating tensions. It's report season. We've had Siemens Healthineers latest quarterly earnings. They've missed estimates. The German medical tech and diagnostics company took a hit from continued supply shortages, China's lockdowns, and lower COVID antigen sales tests hit the numbers. Let's get to the CEO. It's Bernd Montag. He joins me now. Bernd, I'm looking at your guidance. You're going to cut your full year imaging comparable sales. What is it that's hitting you? Is it the supply capacity side or the demand?
So thank you for having me. We are very, very happy with the demand we are seeing. The double-digit order growth, the book-to-bill of 1.3 in the last quarter, I think is a very, very strong message that we have the right products and that the demand out there is extremely high. What made the last quarter a little bit difficult was supply chain challenges in inbound and outbound logistics, mainly caused by the lockdowns in China, which took about a month longer than originally expected. But we are very, very confident that with a strong Q4, we will make sure to make the full year guidance.
Are your Shanghai and Shenzhen operations back at full capacity now?
Yes, they are, and I also want to really give kudos to the teams there who did miracles during the lockdown and were able to limit the effects on our Q3 results. And I think still growth between 3 and 8% of our imaging, Varian, and AT businesses shows that the team weathered the storms extremely well.
How much of a tail risk, black swan event, do you see in the Taiwan Strait? I just laid it out there. 88% of the cargo ships of the world, largest cargo ships, passed through Taiwan last year. How big a risk is that for the world and you?
I mean, first and foremost, I am confident and I hope that everybody is committed to peace. We are very positive in the way our supply chain is set up, also that a lot of the business in China is produced, well, the business for China is produced in China, and the same in Europe and in the United States, so that we can also decouple things. But first and foremost, I think most important is that everybody stays committed to peace.
Well, let's see whether that endures, and that is a global aspiration. Various CEOs that I talk to are able to pass on their price hikes, the supply chain costs, the inflation costs. Are you materially renegotiating any contracts? Are you raising prices on the imaging side of the business, across the business? If so, how much?
So we are not renegotiating existing contracts, of course, but we are implementing pricing measures in new orders. Typically, our book-to-bill time in the equipment business, which is the Varian business, the imaging business, also the advanced therapy system business, has a book-to-bill time of 6 to 18 months, so that the pricing measures which we will see on the revenue side come a little bit later than we see the impact on our own cost side, which is also one of the reasons for slightly compressed margins in the quarter we report about today.
COVID is far from gone. It's very present depending on where you travel in the world. What's the demand like for your rapid tests, your antigen rapid tests?
So demand is still there. Let's say fortunately and unfortunately, we have raised the full year expectation by another, in our numbers, by another 200 million to 1.5 billion. It is a business for us which is not part of the core of what Siemens Healthineers stands for. It shows the agility of Siemens Healthineers and our commitment to global health. But to be very, very honest, I hope for a world without COVID and without the need of this business.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us, Bernd Montag, Siemens Healthineers CEO, your calls on supply chains and beyond. Thank you very much for being with me. Coming up on the show, a deeper dive into those numbers from SocGen, the guidance from Slavomir Krupa, head of global banking, And Investor Solutions at the French lender. We'll get his take on how do you grow the business.
VK ฟิล์มรถยนต์กันร้อนดีราคาถูกรถยนต์เริ่มต้น 3,000 บาท
In the past 2 decades, China has built large infrastructure projects in almost every country in Africa.
African governments themselves said, we are tired of aid and charity. We want to do trade, we want to be treated like partners. The Chinese came along and said, great, we don't do aid and charity, we want to do business with you.
Global Gateway will mobilize 300 billion euros till 2027.
Now the US and Europe are answering back with their own infrastructure initiatives to counter China, but African experts are skeptical.
China has been that guy around the corner with, a bouquet of flowers to Africa, of the US, Europe and the UK have time and time again said, be careful of the flowers you see out of the window, they have thorns on them.
This is a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
Good morning from our Middle East headquarters in Dubai. I'm Manis Krani. It is Daybreak Europe with the stories that set your agenda. Standing with Taiwan, House Speaker Pelosi meets President Tsai and praises one of the world's freest societies. But an enraged China announces provocative military drills and holds some trade by way of retaliation. No pivot. Treasury yields surge after the Fed officials pour cold water on the quick turn away from the current tightening cycle. Plus, OPEC watch. The oil alliance is expected to maintain production levels today, potentially snubbing the White House calls on Saudi Arabia to boost its supplies. Société Générale has outlined new growth targets. They've promised higher profitability. Rising interest rates, global trading rally have provided just some of the tailwinds for the Paris-based lender. The second quarter revenue, operating profit and revenue both beating estimates. We have with us SocGen's head of global banking, Slawomir Krupa. Slawomir, thank you very much for joining me this morning. A great set of numbers, a nice beat. Loan losses are dropping. But I want to get to this guidance that you've given to us. Global markets, you'll grow the revenue 4.7 to 5.3 billion by 2025. Where will the alpha for that growth come from?
So, good morning. Thanks for having me. The alpha for the growth in markets comes from being diversified, being close to your clients, being as innovative as we have been over the last, I say, 3 decades, and making sure that you are organized and ready and able to capture the growth that is in the market. And hence this idea of a range in terms of target, because we want to recognize that depending on the market conditions and market opportunities, we will oscillate, if you will, between these two numbers, but much higher than they had been in the past.
Now, obviously, it's been a blistering return in the markets business in the second quarter, from rates to equities. Were there monster trades? Was it all rates and inflation trades that made these numbers in FIC?
So in FIC, it's a lot of commercial activity across the board for the reasons that you just outlined. Clearly, the demand for positioning on the financial institution side or for hedging on the corporate side has soared in a context which changed and turned dramatically, obviously, because of the war. And so this helped the